When people think of dinosaurs, there is a good chance they first think of T-Rex. The public's imagination has been captivated by it ever since its discovery was announced to the world in 1905. Such fame is not unearned, as Tyrannosaurus rex is the largest terrestrial predator ever found, and was one of the deadliest of all time. However, the Tyrant King's fame has colored the perception of the rest of the carnivorous dinosaurs. Theropoda, the branch of Dinosauria which includes most of the meat-eaters, is often summarized as merely the relatives of Tyrannosaurus rex, and sometimes a small carnivore velociraptor. It is not uncommon for people to have trouble distinguishing other large theropods, such as Allosaurus, the second most famous large meat-eating dinosaur, from T-Rex. Yet the iconic status of Tyrannosaurus is misleading, as it wasn't particularly closely related to most of these other large predators. As one of the three major branches of dinosaurs, Theropoda was very diverse, and the Tyrant King's last common ancestor with predators like Allosaurus lived over 100 million years before it. The true relatives of T-Rex belong to the clade Tyrannosauridae, of which there are currently about 20 recognized species. The first member of this dynasty to be uncovered by paleontologists was not Tyrannosaurus, but Albertosaurus. Albertosaurus looked essentially like a smaller, less bulky version of Tyrannosaurus, bearing a much closer resemblance to it than more distant relatives like Allosaurus did. When T-Rex was found 20 years later, the connection between them was immediately recognized. Tyrannosaurids are characterized by massive skulls capable of crushing bone, tiny arms with only 2 claws, and proportionately long legs. Although the speed of most adult Tyrannosaurids was hampered by their large size, juvenile Tyrannosaurids were among the fastest runners of all dinosaurs. Furthermore, while sometimes exaggerated, Tyrannosaurids were more intelligent than all other known large theropods, and were equipped with exceptionally strong senses. Altogether, the tyrant dinosaurs ruled through a potent combination of speed, intelligence, and raw power, making them some of the most sophisticated hunters the world has ever seen. The Tyrannosaurids have the benefit of being found in some of the most productive and extensively researched dinosaur fossil-bearing formations, so many species, such as Albertosaurus, are known from numerous specimens. Additionally, the public's love of Tyrannosaurus is shared by most paleontologists, so the Tyrannosaurs have received a very disproportionate amount of research relating to nearly every aspect of their biology. Despite being extinct for 66 million years, more is known about the tyrant dinosaurs than many modern animals. As such, to provide a comprehensive summary of this research, this video is correspondingly very long. It will cover when and where they lived, illustrate where Tyrannosauridae belongs within the wider Theropod family tree, provide an overview of every species that makes up the clade, describe the various features that distinguish Tyrannosaurids from other theropods and made them such deadly hunters, outline what is known about how Tyrannosaurids perceive the world, and explain how Tyrannosaurids grew from tiny hatchlings into some of the deadliest predators the world has ever seen. It will also address questions such as whether or not Tyrannosaurs hunted in packs, whether they were covered in feathers or scales, and how they came to be such fearsome apex predators. By the video's end, you'll have a far greater appreciation for the dynasty of T-Rex. The first topic that will be covered is one where most Tyrannosaurs were actually quite different from their most famous representative. Tyrannosaurids typically weighed between 2 to 3 tons, and had a length of 8 to 9 meters. This is greater than the size of most modern hippopotamuses and rhinoceroses, but even they were dwarfed by the record-breaking Tyrannosaurus. Still, such a size was the norm for most other apex predators during the reign of the dinosaurs, placing most Tyrannosaurids at the top of their food chains. There were a handful of smaller Tyrannosaurids, such as Qianzhousaurus, yet even the smallest would still be considered large by today's standards. There were also a few species larger than the norm, with Tyrannosaurus's close relative Tarbosaurus bridging the gap between it and the rest of its relatives. There was even one Tyrannosaur that appears to have matched the size of T-Rex, which will be elaborated on later. The largest 2 Tyrannosaurus rex specimens, nicknamed Sue and Scotty, are 13 meters long, and are estimated to have weighed between 8 to 9 tons. Two fragmentary specimens may be even larger, but they've yet to be described in the scientific literature. These rexes were exceptional, with the average T-Rex reaching a length of 12 meters and weighing between 5 to 7 tons, which was still the size of an elephant. After Tyrannosaurus, most of the largest known theropods are Carcharodontosaurids like Giganotosaurus. They appear to have reached a similar length and height as the Tyrant King, but Carcharodontosaurids were not as heavily built, and therefore weighed slightly less. Given the inherent uncertainty in estimating their exact size due to the lack of complete skeletons, there is the possibility that some Carcharodontosaurids managed to grow larger than Tyrannosaurus, but they certainly outclassed the rest of the Tyrannosaurids. The other contender, Spinosaurus, was actually longer than Tyrannosaurus, but once again doesn't seem to have been as heavy. In any event, these other megatheropods were not contemporaries of Tyrannosaurus. Indeed, while it is nicknamed the King of the Dinosaurs, few dinosaurs would have had the misfortune of meeting a T-Rex or any other Tyrannosaurid. Tyrannosaurid fossils have only been found in Asia and North America. Additionally, despite their iconic status, Tyrannosaurids didn't even exist for most of the Age of Reptiles. The oldest dinosaur fossils are at least 233 million years old, and they didn't become the dominant animals until 200 million years ago, at the start of the Jurassic period. They retained their position until the end of the following Cretaceous period at 66 million years ago. Out of this 134 million year long reign, the Tyrannosaurids were around for just the final 20 million years. This portion of the Late Cretaceous is divided into two ages. The first, the Campanian Age, started 84 million years ago and ended 72 million years ago. It was followed by the Maastrichtian Age, the final chapter of the Age of Reptiles, which ended 66 million years ago. Tyrannosaurus rex itself lived during the late Maastrichtian. Although they were present when the fateful meteor hit the Yucatan Peninsula, Tyrannosaurids were, evolutionarily speaking, a recent addition to Dinosauria's diversity. For most of the Late Cretaceous period, Asia and North America were isolated from the rest of the world, which prevented the Tyrannosaurs from conquering the globe. Furthermore, Tyrannosaurids don't seem to have even inhabited all of North America. For most of the Late Cretaceous, the continent was divided in two, with Appalachia to the east and Laramidia in the west. All North American Tyrannosaurid fossils come from Laramidia. While fossils from Appalachia are much rarer, none of the predators that have been found there are Tyrannosaurids, although they are some of their closest known relatives. T-Rex's name is not entirely unearned, as its kingdom was the largest of any Tyrannosaurid, occupying all of western North America. Beforehand, North America had been split between multiple species of tyrants. While limited in geographical and temporal terms, within their domain, the rule of the Tyrannosaurids was almost uncontested. The only other large predatory dinosaurs that lived alongside them were close relatives, which might belong to Tyrannosauridae anyway. This makes the Tyrannosaurids a characteristic element of the unique ecosystems of Late Cretaceous Laramidia and Asia. Despite their limited range, there is still a distinct regional bias in the Tyrannosaurid fossil record. It is the most complete in the northwestern United States and the nearby southwestern Canadian province of Alberta. The Tyrannosaurid species found here are, almost without exception, known from numerous specimens, with their entire skeletal anatomy being accounted for. These include Albertosaurus, Gorgosaurus, Daspletosaurus, and of course, Tyrannosaurus rex. The Late Cretaceous formations in the southwestern United States have only been studied in detail since the last few decades, so most of the Tyrannosaurid genera from this region are known from fewer and less complete specimens. The formations in Central America and the far north have received even less attention, with the Tyrannosaurid record from these regions being very sparse. In Asia, the Tyrannosaurid fossil record is largely comparable to that of the southwestern United States, with most species only being known from a single, incomplete specimen. The exception is Tarbosaurus, which is known from numerous skeletons. Most Asian Tyrannosaurid fossils come from Mongolia and China, but fragmentary remains have also been found in Japan and the Central Asian country of Kazakhstan, implying they were widespread throughout the continent. However, their fossil record does not extend as far back as the species found in North America. Tyrannosauridae's place in Theropoda was misunderstood for most of the 20th century. A century ago, they were considered the last and most extreme representatives of Carnosauria, the clade which includes Allosaurus. All large theropods used to be lumped in Carnosauria, while the small ones were lumped together in the clade Coelurosauria. During the dinosaur renaissance, it was found that birds were dinosaurs, specifically Coelurosaurs. As the clade was studied more thoroughly in the 1990s, it was found that the Tyrannosaurs shared a number of traits with the Coelurosaurs to the exclusion of other large theropods. Rather than being the last of the Carnosaurs, the Tyrannosaurids were giant Coelurosaurs who had replaced them. This classification is actually in line with the opinion of Barnum Brown, the paleontologist who originally found Tyrannosaurus. A common meme shared over the internet is the idea that the chicken is the closest relative of T-Rex, or even descended from it. This is not true. Although the Tyrannosaurids are more closely related to birds than to most other large carnivores, their ancestors were some of the earliest members of Coelurosauria to split off from the lineage that eventually led to birds, who are instead more closely related to troodontids and dromaeosaurids like Velociraptor. Indeed, early relatives of birds like Archaeopteryx predate Tyrannosauridae by nearly 70 million years. All Coelurosaurs more closely related to the Tyrannosaurids than to birds belong to the clade Tyrannosauridea, whose members are sometimes informally referred to as Tyrannosaurs. Until the early 2000s, this clade was mostly a formality, as there were no known Tyrannosauroids outside of Tyrannosauridae. This changed following the discovery of the European Eotyrannus and the Chinese theropods Dialong and Guanlong, all three of which lived during the late Jurassic or early Cretaceous, tens of millions of years before the Tyrannosaurids. The number of Tyrannosauroids known to science has grown dramatically since then. Most are new discoveries, but a few, such as Stoxosaurus and Proceratosaurus, were found decades earlier, but were only recognized as relatives of the Tyrannosaurids after the discovery of the more complete Chinese Tyrannosauroids. The top predators of Appalachia were also part of Tyrannosauridea. Besides the Appalachian tyrants and the Tyrannosaurids, most Tyrannosauroids were small to medium-sized carnivores. While many times smaller than most Tyrannosaurids, these theropods possessed traits otherwise unique to the later megatyrants. Even though there are still gaps in Tyrannosauroid evolution, a great deal has been learned about them and the rise of the Tyrannosaurids, which will be discussed later in the video. Although not closely related to the tyrant dinosaurs, it is worth providing a brief rundown of the Carnosaurs since they are the dinosaurs the Tyrannosaurids are most frequently compared to. Carnosaurs were the most common apex predators from the Middle Jurassic to the early Cretaceous, and they are generally thought to have been at the top of the food chain just before the emergence of Tyrannosauridae during the late Cretaceous. The quickest way to tell them apart is that Carnosaurs have 3 fingers, while the Tyrannosaurids have 2, but many more differences between them will be elaborated on throughout the video. The Tyrannosaurids were not the only large predators to be removed from Carnosauria. Others, such as the Ceratosaurs, turned out to be neither Carnosaurs nor Coelurosaurs, but instead belonged to more basal positions within Theropoda. Early Ceratosaurs, such as Ceratosaurus itself, were still similar to Carnosaurs, but more derived Ceratosaurs, such as the Albertosaurids, were more divergent. The placement of the theropod clade Megalosauridea is uncertain, but it will be assumed they are Carnosaurs for the purposes of this video. Most megalosaurs, such as Tarbosaurus, were similar to the undisputed Carnosaurs, although Megalosauridea also includes the long-snouted, fish-eating Spinosaurids. At around the same time it was determined that the Tyrannosaurids were giant Coelurosaurs, a genuine group of megacarnosaurs, the Carcharodontosaurids, were discovered. Giant Carcharodontosaurids first appeared during the early Cretaceous, and lasted into the beginning of the late Cretaceous, going extinct just before the initial emergence of the Tyrannosaurids. As for what it means to be a Tyrannosaurid, Tyrannosauridae is officially defined as the clade consisting of Tyrannosaurus, Albertosaurus, its close relative Gorgosaurus, their last common ancestor, and all the descendants of that ancestor. Although it is common for Albertosaurus to be called the ancestor of T-Rex and Media, in truth, they belong to opposite branches of Tyrannosauridae. Albertosaurus's branch, Albertosauridae, is by far the smaller of the two, with Gorgosaurus being the only other genus assigned to it. Albertosaurian bones are more gracile than those of most other Tyrannosaurids. However, this is sometimes exaggerated in the public's eye, as most Albertosaurus and Gorgosaurus skeletons on display at museums belong to subadults. When applied to adult Albertosaurians, the term gracile is very much relative, as they were more robustly built than most carnosaurs. As was typical of most Tyrannosaurids, Albertosaurians grew between 8 to 9 meters long, and were able to reach, and occasionally exceed, a weight of 3 tons. Tyrannosaurus's branch of Tyrannosauridae is the more diverse clade Tyrannosauridae. The names of a lot of units of Tyrannosaurid classification are just slightly different variations of Tyrannosaurus. Tyrannosaurians were generally more robust than Albertosaurians, with wider, deeper skulls. Even so, most Tyrannosaurians were still substantially smaller than Tyrannosaurus. The truly giant Tyrannosaurs belong to a subclade of Tyrannosauridae called Tyrannosauridae, another derivative of Tyrannosaurus, which consist of Tyrannosaurus itself and 2 to 3 species from Asia. Tyrannosaurids were so rotund that the adults were not just slower than their more gracile ancestors, they were incapable of running. Outside of Tyrannosauridae, the interrelationships of the rest of Tyrannosauridae are contentious, but the giant Tyrannosaurids are generally thought to have been closely related to the Tyrannosaurid genus Daspletosaurus. Another major branch of Tyrannosauridae is the subclade Teratophoneus, whose members primarily inhabited southern Laramidia. As late Cretaceous formations from this region have only recently been studied in detail, the Teratophoneans were unknown to science until relatively recently. Perhaps the strangest Tyrannosaurids were the long-snouted Allosaurus. Whereas Tyrannosaurus took the size and power of Tyrannosauridae to new extremes, the Allosaurus evolved in the opposite direction, being smaller and more lightly built than even the Albertosaurians, a stark reversal of the evolutionary trends exhibited by the rest of Tyrannosauridae. Indeed, they and another Tyrannosaurian named Asiatyrannus are the only Tyrannosaurids that don't appear to have been apex predators. Some studies have actually placed Allosaurus just outside of Tyrannosauridae, but when traits connected to large body size are excluded from phylogenetic analyses, the Allosaurus are instead found to be placed within Tyrannosauridae. Still, it is important to keep in mind that the traits and behaviors of the rest of Tyrannosauridae don't always apply to the highly divergent, gracile Allosaurus. The next section is a summary of each of the roughly 20 known species of Tyrannosaurids. Exactly when Tyrannosauridae evolved is unclear, but the oldest known Tyrannosaurid is the teratophonan Tyrannosaurian Lythronax, the Gore King. It lived in Utah during the beginning of the Campanian Age 81.5 million years ago, although the first Tyrannosaurids probably appeared several million years earlier. Lythronax's snout was relatively short, and, like that of Tyrannosaurus, the back of its skull was very wide. Lythronax wasn't particularly large, possessing a length of 7.5 meters and a weight of just 1.5 tons. However, its skeleton was heavily built. Some paleontologists consider Lythronax to be more closely related to the Tyrannosaurians than Daspletosaurus was, with scientist Gregory S. Paul going as far as to suggest it was a species of Tyrannosaurus. However, most recent research suggests that Lythronax and the other teratophonans were much more distant relatives of the Tyrant King. Their similarities may have instead been the result of evolutionary convergence, and in any event, Lythronax's shortened snout was far less deep than that of Tyrannosaurus. 78 million years ago, what would become the American Southwest was the domain of the teratophonan Diamoterror, the powerful terror ruler. Such grandiose names have become common for Tyrannosaurids found in the 21st century. In spite of its fearsome title, Diamoterra remains fairly obscure since the actual fossils assigned to it are limited, to the extent that its validity has been questioned. Another, less fragmentary skeleton has been found, but until it is described, Diamoterra remains the least researched of the Tyrannosaurids. The namesake of Teratophoneus, Teratophoneus, lived 76 million years ago. Its full binomial name, Teratophoneus currii, means Curry's monstrous murderer, in honor of Tyrannosaur expert Dr. Philip J. Curry. Like its relative Lythronax, Teratophoneus was small for a Tyrannosaurid, with a length between 7 to a little under 9 meters. Some older sources claim it was only 6 meters long, but the specimen this size was estimated from was a subadult. Also like Lythronax, its snout was deep and relatively short, but Teratophoneus isn't thought to have been as robust as the Gore King. 1 million years after the reign of Teratophoneus, the dominant predator of the American Southwest was Bastahia versor, the Bastahi destroyer. Some studies have placed Bastahia versor within Teratophoneus. Others, including the original description, found it to merely be a large Tyrannosauroid closely related to the Tyrannosaurids, even more so than the Appalachian tyrants. At the very least, Bastahia versor already had most of the traits that distinguished the Tyrannosaurids from other Tyrannosauroids, and in turn, other large theropods like the Carnosaurs. Therefore, Bastahia versor will be assumed to be a member of Tyrannosauridae for the purposes of this video. Bastahia versor was succeeded by the recently discovered teratophonin Labocania aguilinae. Its fossils are found in the Mexican Cerro del Pueblo Formation, which was formed near the end of the Campanian Age 73 million years ago. Labocania aguilinae is only known from fragmentary fossils. To put this into context, the traditional Tyrannosaurid in this illustration fits the available fossil evidence of Labocania aguilinae just as much as the hypothetical, kiwi-like theropods at the top, although the former reconstruction is significantly more parsimonious than the latter. A second species of Labocania, Labocania anomala, is found in the Mexican La Banca Roja Formation. Its fossils are likewise fragmentary. Indeed, despite being known to science for half a century, it wasn't clear whether or not Labocania anomala was even a tyrannosaur until the discovery of Labocania aguilinae, with some paleontologists formally suggesting it was a Carcharodontosaurid or even an Abelosaurid. A major source of doubt was the shape of the teeth at the tip of its snout, as they are different from those found in all other known Tyrannosauroids. The age of the La Banca Roja Formation is also uncertain, so it is unclear whether or not Labocania anomala lived before or after Labocania aguilinae. Northern Laramidia was ruled by a different caste of tyrants. Among them was Thanothoristes. The second oldest Tyrannosaurid, this Tyrannosaurian prowled in what is now the Canadian province of Alberta 80 million years ago, between the reigns of Lythronax and Diamoterra. Thanothoristes' name means either Reaper of Death or Death Harvester. Thanothoristes isn't known from substantial remains, but fortunately, the same is not true of its close relative and possible descendant, Daspletosaurus, the frightful reptile. Daspletosaurus inhabited Alberta and the state of Montana between 78 to 74 million years ago. In many ways the most normal Tyrannosaurid, Daspletosaurus was between 8 to 9 meters long, with a weight between 2 to 3 tons. However, one exceptional Daspletosaurus specimen is a staggering 11 meters long. Unlike most Tyrannosaurid genera, Daspletosaurus contains multiple species: Daspletosaurus torsus, Daspletosaurus horneri, and Daspletosaurus wilsoni, along with a fourth, as of yet unnamed species. They appear to form an antigenetic lineage, a single population that changed over time. What's more, the younger species of Daspletosaurus became progressively more and more like the Tyrannosaurians. So rather than just being a close relative, Daspletosaurus seems to have been the actual ancestor of Tyrannosaurus. While most ecosystems were host to just one species of Tyrannosaurid, Daspletosaurus is also notable for coexisting with the smaller Albertosaurian Gorgosaurus libratus, the fierce reptile. Gorgosaurus's fossils are dated to about 75 million years ago, and it is currently the oldest known Albertosaurine. Gorgosaurus is very similar to Albertosaurus, and may even be its direct ancestor. Some paleontologists actually contend that the two are not distinct enough to warrant being placed in separate genera, and that Gorgosaurus should be considered a second species of Albertosaurus, but this is currently a minority position. The record of Campanian Tyrannosaurids in Asia is less extensive than in North America. While Tyrannosaurid fossils have been found in the same formations as the famous Velociraptor and Protoceratops, they are fragmentary. It is thought that the Tyrannosaurid and most of the other large Mongolian dinosaurs from this time merely migrated through the Mongolian desert, hence their rarity compared to the more famous small dinosaurs. The oldest named Asian Tyrannosaurid is the giant Tyrannosaurin Zhucheng tyrannus, which lived in China 73 million years ago, near the end of the Campanian Age. It is mostly known from a skull, but its morphology and size are broadly similar to Tarbosaurus batar, the other notable Asian Tyrannosaurin. It lived 70 million years ago during the early Maastrichtian, and was the first Tyrannosaurid found in Asia, with fossils uncovered in both China and Mongolia. Besides T-Rex, and perhaps Albertosaurus, Tarbosaurus is the most famous Tyrannosaurid. A strict translation of its name is heroic alarming lizard, but as noted by Steven from Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong, it could be stretched to mean Awesomesaurus hero. Tarbosaurus range from 10 to 12 meters long, which extends into the lower range of adult Tyrannosaurus. However, the Asian tyrant was not as heavily built as equally long Tyrannosaurus, but it was still much bulkier than other Tyrannosaurids. Tarbosaurus was more than a slightly smaller Protorex, and, as will be elaborated on later, possessed divergent adaptations that suggest a unique style of hunting. Perhaps the most enigmatic Tyrannosaurid is Raptor X. The only specimen was not excavated by paleontologists, so it is uncertain what formation or even country it was found in. When Raptor X was first described, it was thought to have been a small Tyrannosauroid from the early Cretaceous distantly related to the Tyrannosaurids. A later reanalysis of the fossils found that was probably instead a 3-year-old Tarbosaurus. In the past, other genera originally thought to represent new tyrannosaurs, such as Qianzhousaurus, later turned out to be a juvenile Tarbosaurus. But further investigation by paleontologist Dr. Thomas Carr found some differences between Raptor X and young Tarbosaurus. This suggests that Raptor X is a valid taxon, which represents a new species of Tyrannosaurin. While the only known Raptor X specimen is less than 3 meters long, like other Tyrannosaurins, an adult would have been one of the largest predators of all time. Tarbosaurus also coexisted with Alioramus remotus and Alioramus altai, the namesakes of Alioramini. Both species are only known from a juvenile and subadult respectively, and since they are from different developmental stages, not all paleontologists are convinced that they are separate species. Whereas Tarbosaurus was the king of their habitat, both species of Alioramus are thought to have been medium-sized carnivores. Their close relative, Qianzhousaurus, is considered to be a close match of their adult form. Nicknamed Pinocchio Rex on account of its elongated snout, Qianzhousaurus is currently the only other known Alioramin. It was about 6 meters long, and is one of the few adult Tyrannosaurids known to have weighed under a ton. Given the presence of much larger Tyrannosaurid teeth in the same formation, Pinocchio Rex was not the top predator of its environment. However, it also wasn't the smallest Tyrannosaurid. That honor instead goes to the Tyrannosaurine Asia tyrannus, which was about 4 meters long. The only known specimen of this mini-tyrant was a subadult, but it was not far from maturity when it died, and it is only half as large as other Tyrannosaurid skeletons from similar developmental stages. Asia tyrannus does not seem to have been closely related to the Alioramins, and it retained the deep snout of its ancestors. Both it and Qianzhousaurus lived in southern China between 67 to 66 million years ago during the late Maastrichtian, making them, along with T-Rex, some of the last Tyrannosaurids. Back in North America, many of the top predators during the early Maastrichtian remained similar to those from the Campanian. Among these was Nanuqsaurus. Nanuqsaurus was a Tyrannosaurine, although it was not closely related to the Teratophoneans nor the massive Tyrannosaurids. While it is only known from very limited remains, they were found in Alaska, which was already within the Arctic Circle. Although warmer than today, this region would have still regularly seen snow, and large portions of the year would have been in complete darkness. While always considered an apex predator, Nanuqsaurus was initially thought to be small for a Tyrannosaurid, which is how it was portrayed in the documentary Prehistoric Planet. Its smaller size was attributed to the colder, harsher climate of the Late Cretaceous far north. However, much like Teratophoneus, the first Nanuqsaurus fossils came from immature specimens, and more recently discovered material suggests a size comparable to those of most other North American Tyrannosaurids. The idea that Nanuqsaurus became smaller due to living in an Arctic environment also contradicts Bergman's rule, which states that animals in cold environments are generally larger, not smaller, than their cousins in warm environments. Still, Nanuqsaurus is the youngest known tyrannosaurian that wasn't a titan like Tyrannosaurus. A bit further south, the top predator in Alberta 70 million years ago was, appropriately enough, Albertosaurus sarcophagus. Despite appearing to have been at the top of the food chain, Albertosaurus was neither larger nor more robust than its probable ancestor, the gracile Gorgosaurus. All North American tyrannosaurids were large predators, but the standard of what it meant to be one was about to change. Albertosaurus and Nanuqsaurus both lived just before the rise of Tyrannosaurus rex itself. Albertosaurus in particular has generally been seen as the tyrant that was dethroned by the tyrant king. It was once believed that Tyrannosauridae evolved in Asia, since that is where both Tarbosaurus and Zhuchengtyrannus were found, and that Tyrannosaurus was an invasive species which wiped out the smaller North American Tyrannosaurids upon its arrival. It is not hard to see how this could happen, as Tyrannosaurus was 2 to 3 times larger than the Albertan tyrant. Tyrants, in the original Greek sense, were not just oppressive rulers, but had usurped power, usually from a democracy or oligarchy. While not known when it was first found, this would make the name Tyrannosaurus rex all the more appropriate. However, it is now believed that Tyrannosaurus may have instead originated in southern Laramidia. This is because of a recent discovery of a second, older species of Tyrannosaurus. Named Tyrannosaurus micraensis, it inhabited southwestern North America roughly 73 million years ago, during the early Maastrichtian, or perhaps even the late Campanian. Tyrannosaurus micraensis is distinguished from its more famous cousin by relatively minor differences, such as a narrower skull, shallower jaws, and the crust above its eyes, which were smaller than those of T. rex. Notably, the only known specimen of Tyrannosaurus micraensis is estimated to have been 12 meters long, making it the only theropod able to match the size of the tyrant king. Although it predates it, Tyrannosaurus micraensis possesses a few unique traits that suggest it and T. rex were not ancestor and descendant. These include a skull bone called the prearticular, which is gently curved in Tyrannosaurus micraensis, but strongly bent in all other Tyrannosaurids. Such a trait may seem unimportant, but it implies there was a second species of Tyrannosaurus running around at the time. About 68 million years ago, T. rex expanded to all of western North America, ranging from Mexico to Alaska. While Laramidia still consisted of at least 3 distinct ecosystems, they were all occupied by the tyrant king. Its reign lasted until 66 million years ago, when it was cut short by the meteor that ended the Age of Dinosaurs. Until then, it ruled nearly all of western North America, making Tyrannosaurus rex perhaps the most successful of the tyrant dinosaurs, even ignoring its almost unmatched size and power. Even before T. rex, Tyrannosauridae was never particularly diverse. Besides the Alioramans and Asia Tyrannus, they were all large predators, and late Cretaceous ecosystems were rarely host to more than one species of such voracious carnivores. In North America, there were perhaps as few as 4 to 5 concurrent lineages of Tyrannosaurids at a time. However, there are still gaps in their evolution, so it is clear that many more species of Tyrannosaurid remain to be found. There are also some species that may or may not belong to Tyrannosauridae. While there's debate among scientists regarding whether the Alioramans and Bistachiaversor are true Tyrannosaurids or merely close relatives, other potential tyrants may not even be valid species. The most famous example is Nanotyrannus, whose fossils might actually belong to juvenile Tyrannosaurus. However, some paleontologists consider it to be a separate species of small tyrannosaur that filled the niche of medium-sized predator in the shadow of Tyrannosaurus. The advocates of Nanotyrannus have typically considered it an Albertosaurine. However, a recent paper has instead placed it outside of Tyrannosauridae, while also suggesting that some of its purported remains belong to a separate, closely related genus called Stegovenator. A paper published in 2022 claimed that what has been called T-Rex is actually 3 species, the other 2 being named Tyrannosaurus regina and Tyrannosaurus imperator. Tyrannosaurus imperator was held to be the oldest of the 3, while Tyrannosaurus rex and Tyrannosaurus regina were viewed as contemporaries both descended from T. imperator. The skeletons of T. regina were found to be the more gracile of the 2, allowing them to coexist by focusing on different prey animals. Given how the purported differences cited between the 3 tyrants in the initial publication were ambiguous, this hypothesis hasn't received much support. However, it should not be discounted entirely, as a currently unpublished paper has found additional differences that may make a better case for splitting up T-Rex. A tyrannosaurid from the late Maastrichtian Ojo Alamo Formation in New Mexico, nicknamed Alamo-Tyrannus, may be a new species, but the description is currently awaiting publication. Another potential tyrannosaurid is Electrosaurus. All definitive fossils belonging to this tyrannosauroid are from its hind limb, which appears to have belonged to a gracile animal similar to the Alioramans. Electrosaurus lived in Central Asia, although the ages of the formations it is found in are uncertain. They may date to the beginning of the Late Cretaceous, before the oldest known Tyrannosaurids, or to the Campanian or Maastrichtian ages, during Tyrannosauridae's heyday. Perhaps the most iconic trait of the Tyrannosaurids was their disproportionately large skulls. In life, Tyrannosaurid heads didn't just look like the skulls outlined with skin, as has been popularized by the stylized depiction in Jurassic Park. The heads of real Tyrannosaurids had a lot more flesh, a large part of which was muscle. In life or death, they are easily distinguished from those of other meat-eating dinosaurs. Carnosaur skulls are typically compressed on the sides, with a small profile when viewed from the front. In contrast, Tyrannosaurid skulls are much wider. Their snouts are broad and U-shaped, while the back of the skull bulges outwards, which provided attachment points for greatly enlarged jaw and neck muscles. Unsurprisingly, Tyrannosaurus rex's skull is the widest of all. Abelisaurids also had wide skulls, but their snouts are shorter than those of Tyrannosaurids. Those of many species can reach a length of 1 meter, and the largest T-Rex specimens are over half a meter longer. Tyrannosaurid skulls are also deep, particularly in the Tyrannosaurines, further increasing their size. All of this served to create a devastating bite, one that could crush even bone. The bite force of Tyrannosaurus rex was 35,000 newtons. This is well above what would be expected for a carnivore of its already exceptional size, and is an order of magnitude greater than the bite force of the saltwater crocodile, the current record holder among at least partially terrestrial animals. Indeed, the jaws of the Tyrant King were more powerful than those of any other known terrestrial carnivore. Just behind the Tyrant King in power was Tarbosaurus, whose bite force was the equivalent of a young adult Tyrannosaurus. While not as powerful as the gigantic Tyrannosaurins, the ability to shatter bone was the norm among the rest of the Tyrannosaurids. This enabled them to kill large prey animals with a single, well-placed bite. It also played an important role when feeding, and numerous Tyrannosaurid bite marks have been found left deep in the bones of their meals. The reason Tyrannosaurid skulls were so much more robust than those of carnosaurs wasn't just to generate the power needed to crush bone, but to do so more than once. Without proper reinforcement, their massive jaw muscles would have broken their own bones. Their skull bones, even those that didn't directly contribute to their bone-crushing bites, were tightly bound together. A notable example of this can be found in their nasals. While those of most theropods were made up of two bones, the nasals of the Tyrannosaurids had fused together. Their secondary palates had also ossified, further strengthening their skulls. This trait evolved convergently in the Spinosaurids, but this was primarily to mitigate the detrimental effect their elongated, narrow skulls had on their ability to resist stress. Ossified secondary palates are also found in the marine pliosaurs, which did have powerful bites, but they still emerged partially to make up for their long, flattened skulls. In the case of the Tyrannosaurids, their secondary palates evolved purely to increase the power of their jaws, rather than retain it. This was also true for the ancestors of crocodilians, although this trait has since allowed the crocodilians themselves to adopt a more pliosaur-like skull shape. While Tyrannosaurid skulls were built to be incredibly sturdy, they also had a surprisingly large number of holes and hollow spaces, which served to reduce the weight of their enlarged heads. Their expanded sinuses also contributed to their enhanced sense of smell. While it might seem that these spaces would compromise the skull's integrity when biting down, their bones were positioned so that the strain was directed away from these weak spots. An example can be seen in their orbits, the openings that held the eye sockets. Since the circular orbits ancestral to the dinosaurs would have been easily deformed from stress, most Tyrannosaurids shifted to a compressed, keyhole shape. The actual eye only occupied the upper portion of the orbits, although their absolute size was still impressive, with Tyrannosaurus rex thought to possess the largest eyes of any land animal. Besides reinforcing the skull, the keyhole-shaped orbits also opened up additional space for their jaw muscles. Keyhole orbits were not present in Tyrannosaurid Juveniles, manifesting only as they matured. The condition is also most pronounced in Tyrannosaurus, while the orbits of the more gracile Alioramines and Albertosaurines were more circular. The bone-crushing capabilities of the Albertosaurines were weaker than those of most other Tyrannosaurids. Their skulls and teeth were slenderer, lower, and a bit shorter than those of Tyrannosaurines, and their teeth were also not quite as robust. Even so, Albertosaurines are generally considered to have been bone crushers, although they were probably unable to pulverize larger bones. Tyrannosaurid ecologies were not identical even between closely related genera like Tyrannosaurus and Tarbosaurus. There is a ridge in Tarbosaurus' lower jaw that locked the angular and dentary bones together, which reduced the lower jaw's flexibility, but provided greater stability. This feature is absent in Tyrannosaurus, but a similar jaw-locking mechanism is found in Bistahioversor and Alioramus. However, the skulls of Alioramus and Qianzhousaurus were otherwise quite different from those of other Tyrannosaurids, as they had low skulls and comparatively slender snouts. Most of the traits that made Tyrannosaurid skulls so powerful are likewise reduced or outright absent in the delicate skulls of the Alioramans. Although their snouts were elongated, the region behind the orbits was smaller, providing less space for jaw muscles. Altogether, the bite force of an adult Qianzhousaurus was only twice as strong as the far smaller Dromaeosaurus. In contrast, Asiatyrannus had a robust skull more reminiscent of larger species of Tyrannosaurids despite being the smallest member of the clade. The long, low snouts of the Alioramans did come with advantages, as their shape enabled them to close quicker. Predators with such adaptations today tend to specialize in hunting smaller, faster prey, just as the Alioramans are thought to have done. Although the nickname Pinocchio Rex may sound silly, Qianzhousaurus' elongated snout helped it to make it even more deadly. It is important to note that the skulls of juvenile Tyrannosaurids differed considerably from those of the adults. In the words of Dr. Philip Curry, allometric differences between mature specimens of different Tyrannosaurid species are shown to be trivial when compared to the allometric differences associated with growth. Much like the rest of their bodies, practically everything about their skulls is more gracile than their adult forms. Besides lacking keyhole-shaped orbits, juvenile Tyrannosaurid skulls were proportionately smaller, their shape lower and narrower, and they had a more open, less sturdy frame. Since they were still growing, their skull bones were also not tightly fused together. As such, they were unable to crush bone, and their bite forces were an order of magnitude lower than in adults. In spite of all of this, the jaws of Tyrannosaurid Juveniles were still more powerful than Allosaurus of equivalent size. Weak or strong, Tyrannosaurid necks were adapted for the rapid movements needed to deliver their jaws' often devastating strikes. However, while Carnosaur neck vertebrae had flexible ball and socket joints, Tyrannosaurid neck vertebrae instead had stiffer, flatter joints. This was likely because their necks had evolved to become shorter to support their enlarged skulls, particularly in the more robust Tyrannosaurians. The teeth of most carnivorous dinosaurs are zyphodont, meaning they were recurved, serrated, and compressed on the sides, which made them well adapted for slicing through flesh. These sorts of teeth are present in Tyrannosaurid Juveniles, but those of the bone-crushing adults are thicker, often to the point of being outright circular. Many of their teeth are also exceptionally long, for which they have been described as killer bananas. Unlike the teeth of carnosaurs, and indeed most other reptiles, Tyrannosaurids were heterodont, possessing multiple types of teeth. The longest teeth were in the middle of the jaws, and are thought to have been used for holding onto their prey. The teeth in the back of the jaw were shorter and not as recurved, which made them best suited for crushing. The final type of tooth was located in the premaxilla, the bone that formed the end of the upper jaw, which was shorter in Tyrannosauroids compared to other theropods. The premaxillary teeth were small and D-shaped. Their primary purpose was to help pull meat off the bones when feeding. It is these D-shaped teeth that are absent in Labocania. On the other hand, even though it didn't have a strong bite, Qianzhousaurus' teeth have the same robust morphology as its larger, bone-crushing relatives. The main distinction between them is that Allosaurus teeth are smaller and more numerous. All types of Tyrannosaurid teeth had long roots to prevent them from breaking off, which further increased the resemblance of the long holding teeth to bananas. Still, regularly grappling struggling animals and shattering bones took their toll, and like most other theropods and today's crocodilians, Tyrannosaurids replaced their teeth throughout their lives. Large carnivores like Tyrannosaurids were rare components in their ecosystems, and their teeth were replaced about every year or two, slower than seen in crocodilians and most other theropods. Still, their fossilized teeth are common enough that they can serve as a reliable indicator of their presence in a region. Tyrannosaurid teeth were found as far back as the 1850s, but they were initially assigned to the genus Dinodon. Most scientists actually referred to Tyrannosauridae as Dinodontidae until the description of Daspletosaurus in 1970, which found the teeth originally assigned to Dinodon to be undiagnostic, and therefore invalid as a holotype. Carnosaur teeth were adapted to wear down large animals through blood loss. An individual strike was less likely to be decisive, but they also wouldn't require as much individual risk. They also had the benefit of allowing for lighter skulls, which is why zyphodont teeth were retained in the gracile Tyrannosaurid Juveniles. However, unlike carnosaurs, it is doubtful young Tyrannosaurids hunted animals as large or larger than themselves, at least not without the support of the larger adults. Carnosaurs are sometimes described as possessing weak jaws, but this is only in comparison to the exceptional Tyrannosaurids. While not adapted to crush bone, they were still capable of dismembering their prey, and shallow bite marks left by carnosaurs are regularly found on the bones of herbivorous dinosaurs. On the other hand, there were considerable differences in not just how these two types of predators killed, but also in how they ate. The D-shaped teeth of the Tyrannosaurids were used to scrape meat off the bone. This motion left distinctive, shallow bite marks, which are only found in what were the muscular parts of their prey's body. In the Albertosaurines, the premaxillary teeth were supported by the teeth in the lower jaw. However, Tyrannosaurus had a small overbite, so the premaxillary teeth acted alone in this larger tyrant. Another way Tyrannosaurids fed was the puncture and pull method. Just like it sounds, they bit deep into the flesh with their teeth, and then pulled back to tear it off. Puncture and pull feeding was common among other theropods, but because adult Tyrannosaurid teeth were not as efficient at slicing, they were more reliant on the strength of their powerful neck muscles. To demonstrate what they were capable of, bite marks on Triceratops' frills indicate Tyrannosaurus commonly ripped off their skulls when feeding, so as to access the muscles on the back of their necks. Tyrannosaurids are thought to have evolved to feed quickly, which is an adaptation to avoid competition over kills with other large carnivores. In this case, it would have primarily been other Tyrannosaurids, and perhaps even fellow pack members. Their messy eating habits were partially responsible for their lost teeth, although this should not be exaggerated. Bite marks left by a Tarbosaurus scavenging the leg of the Hadrosaurus orolophus display both skill and carefulness when it fed. Examination of Tyrannosaurid coprolites shows they engaged in osteophagy, or the consumption of bone. This behavior is common among modern mammalian carnivores, but was more limited among theropod dinosaurs on account of their inability to chew. They may have swallowed smaller bones whole, and similar behavior seems to have been present in young Tyrannosaurids, as evidenced by the stomach contents of a juvenile Gorgosaurus. In contrast, the jaws of many adult Tyrannosaurids were powerful enough to break larger bones apart with ease. Although still unable to properly chew, the bone fragments left in their coprolites show the Tyrannosaurids were able to efficiently process bone. Still, to avoid needlessly damaging their teeth, they would have normally avoided consuming the largest bones when feeding. As will be elaborated on later, Dinosaurids juveniles are thought to have been more common than adult individuals, but their skeletons are far less common, particularly in Late Cretaceous North America. Unlike adults, Tyrannosaurids would have left little to nothing of their skeletons after feeding, partially explaining their rarity. There was a predator who had similar bone-crushing adaptations and osteophagous habits like those of the Tyrannosaurids, which predated them by over 100 million years. Named Raysan androgobe, it had a broad, deep skull and large, robust, and serrated teeth. While it lived during the Middle Jurassic, after the rise of the dinosaurs, Raysan androgobe wasn't a dinosaur itself. Instead, it was a crocodilomorph, a distant, terrestrial relative of crocodilians. While it was one of the largest predators in Middle Jurassic Madagascar, Raysan androgobe's relatives, the Sebecosuchians, don't seem to have had the same success as the Tyrannosaurids, but small and medium-sized species could be found in Europe and much of the southern hemisphere during the Late Cretaceous. One of the major Sebecosuchian subclades, the Baurusuchids, had fairly weak jaws. Another, the Sebecids, had more powerful jaws, but they still lacked the crushing teeth of the tyrant dinosaurs. Still, the Sebecids survived the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous that wiped out the Tyrannosaurids and all other non-avian dinosaurs. And some Sebecids, like Barynosuchus, grew larger than any terrestrial mammalian predator, making these four-legged crocodilomorphs the closest evolution has come to recreating the Tyrannosaurids. While more subtle than the horns of Ceratosaurus or the plates of Dilophosaurus, Tyrannosaurid skulls were heavily ornamented. The tops of their snouts have a rugose texture, which indicates they were covered in thickened, cornified skin and keratinous plates. Most Tyrannosaurids had protrusions called lacrimal horns in front of their eyes. Behind the eyes were another set of protrusions called postorbital bosses. The postorbital bosses of the giant Tyrannosaurians were more prominent than those of most of their smaller relatives, but adults lacked true lacrimal horns. As they matured, their lacrimal horns became swollen and expanded into two ridges that merged into the rugose snout. Daspletosaurus, the probable ancestor of the Tyrannosaurians, also had greatly enlarged postorbital bosses, but it retained its lacrimal horns. Tyrannosaurids also had an additional horn on their jugular, a bone behind the upper tooth row and below the eyes. While called the jugular horn, it was not actually an outgrowth of the jugular, but a separate bone that fused to it as the tyrants grew. The snouts of the Alioramans also possess horn-like bumps, the number of which varies between species. The ornamentation on Tyrannosaurid skulls is thought to have been used to help attract mates. Supporting this, they are absent or only barely developed throughout much of the juvenile stage. While not as flashy as the crest of some other theropods, these structures were also less fragile, matching the often brutal lifestyles of the Tyrannosaurids. It has also been proposed that the horns were used to help distinguish different species from each other. However, they were covered in keratin, which doesn't usually fossilize, so their exact size and shape in life is uncertain. These horns, bosses, and reinforced snouts may not have just been for show. Their sturdy construction would have made them useful during headbutting contests. The tops of Tyrannosaurid snouts also show evidence of supporting keratinous pads, which would have made them even better suited for such behavior. Given just how powerful the jaws of all but the weakest of the Tyrannosaurids had become, there was clear evolutionary pressure to develop a less dangerous method of resolving conflict with other Tyrannosaurids. However, they often did resort to more violent means, as many Tyrannosaurid skulls bear the bite marks of other Tyrannosaurids. Their hardened snouts, combined with their reinforced skull bones, could have also allowed their heads to be used as rams to knock over other large dinosaurs, leaving them vulnerable to being pinned by their giant feet, or finished off with a final strike. The Tyrannosaurid's exceptionally strong skulls make their tiny, two-fingered forelimbs all the more underwhelming. While the main weapon of carnivorous dinosaurs had always been their teeth, the Tyrannosaurids took this to an extreme. Their arms were far too short to catch anything before it was already in reach of their mouth, and the damage that could be dealt by their two claws was marginal compared to their jaws' ability to pierce flesh and shatter bone. The arms had shrunk so much that they could not even reach their mouths, or, in at least most species, each other. The arms of Tyrannosaurus rex were about 1 meter long. If a human had the same limb proportions as T-Rex, their arms would only have a length of 5 inches, or about 13 centimeters. Still, Tyrannosaurus's arms were longer than those of a human in absolute terms, as a consequence of its massive body size. In this case, Tyrannosaurus wasn't the most extreme Tyrannosaurid. The arms of the Albertosaurines were proportionately smaller, and those of Tarbosaurus were the proportionally shortest forelimbs of any tyrant dinosaur. Daspletosaurus's forelimbs are the longest, but they were still tiny when compared to other theropods. Curiously, its hind limbs were also the shortest within Tyrannosauridae. Besides their limited reach, Tyrannosaurid Arms also had a restricted range of movement, which was most pronounced in Teratophoneus. The arms of Tyrannosaurid Juveniles were proportionately longer than those of the adults, so they may have played a greater role during their youth. Whether this extended to the medium-sized Asiatyrannus and the Allosaurus is unknown, as no forelimb material belonging to either of them has been found. Some species, including specimens of T-Rex, have been found with a vestigial third metacarpal. This is sometimes reported as a third finger, but metacarpals are actually the hand bones that the fingers attach to, not fingers themselves. The Tyrannosaurids weren't the first theropods to lose extra digits. Although the last common ancestor of the Allosaurs and Carnosaurs had 3 fingers, more primitive theropods had 4, and dinosaurs ancestrally had 5. That the Tyrannosaurids had incredibly powerful skulls but puny arms is not thought to have been a coincidence. As the skull became more and more capable, large arms became increasingly redundant. Furthermore, as Tyrannosaurid skulls became larger, they also became more top-heavy. Their large tails served as a counterbalance, but they could only do so much, and increasing the weight of the tail meant increasing the weight of the whole animal. Shrinking the forelimbs increased the Tyrannosaurid's stability, while also reducing their overall weight. Given just how deadly their jaws had become, this did little to reduce their lethality. Paleontologist Dr. Kevin Payton has suggested that Tyrannosaurid forelimbs became smaller not just because they were overshadowed by their own bone-crushing jaws, but also those of their peers. As mentioned earlier, bite marks indicate that Tyrannosaurids regularly fought each other, and longer arms would have been easy targets for their rivals to bite off. While losing them in a fight might not seem like a great loss, since the diminutive size they ended up taking shows they weren't that important anyway, having them bitten off put the tyrant at risk of shock, blood loss, and infection. There were some other dinosaurs which had, superficially, Tyrannosaurid-like hands. The Oviraptorosaur Oxoco-Avaricin, a contemporary of Tarbosaurus and Allosaurus, only had 2 functional fingers. The same was also true of Qianzhousaurus, a dinosaur from late Jurassic South America, whose place within Dinosauria is highly controversial. A recently discovered two-fingered dinosaur is Deinonychus. It was a therizinosaur, a group of herbivorous Coelurosaurian theropods famous for their massive claws. While most obvious in Deinonychus, the forelimbs of none of these dinosaurs were reduced in size compared to those of the Tyrannosaurids. The enigmatic South American theropod Gualicho is often reconstructed with only two fingers, but it possessed a third metacarpal that was large enough to support a small but functional third finger. Another group of dinosaurs with forelimbs similar to the Tyrannosaurids were the gigantic Carcharodontosaurids. Although these carnosaurs retained all three fingers, their arms have become too small to serve as major components of their arsenal, just like the Tyrannosaurids. The forelimbs of the Carcharodontosaurid Meraxes even had the same diminutive proportions as those of the Tyrannosaurids, while those of the Carcharodontosaurid Tyrovenator were even smaller. This appears to have been for the exact same reason as in the Tyrannosaurids. Although they did not have a bone-crushing bite, Carcharodontosaurid skulls had still become massive and deep compared to earlier carnosaurs like Allosaurus or Qianzhousaurus. The Albertosaurus also had small arms, but although their skulls were deep, their short snouts meant they were not as heavy as those of Tyrannosaurids. Their forelimbs may have instead shrunk due to their longer necks and torsos shifting their body's center of gravity. Bite marks have also been found on the bones of the Albertosaurid Majungasaurus, which were made by other Majungasaurus, suggesting that Albertosaurids may have also regularly fought each other, and therefore, like the Tyrannosaurids, long arms may have become a liability. However, the research regarding Albertosaurid paleopathologies and behavior in general is far less extensive than that of Tyrannosaurids. Even though Albertosaurids had twice as many fingers as the Tyrannosaurids, they were so tiny that they made the arms of the tyrant dinosaurs seem overbuilt in comparison. The fingers of some species didn't even have claws, while those of the Tyrannosaurids were still built like weapons. This highlights an important difference between the two. Unlike Albertosaurid forelimbs, those of the Tyrannosaurids were not outright vestigial. They just weren't as important as they had been in their three-fingered ancestors. They still possessed numerous muscle attachment points, and an adult Tyrannosaurus is estimated to have been able to bench press over 400 pounds. This is twice as much as the average human is capable of, although there are some exceptional individuals who could outdo the Tyrant King in this particular regard. Furthermore, if Tyrannosaurid arms were truly useless, it would be expected that they would have become shorter over the course of their evolution. Instead, they stayed roughly the same size for millions of years. This brings up the question of what they were doing with them. One of the oldest hypotheses regarding their function is that they were used to hold onto each other when mating. Tyrannosaurid arms could have also been retained as display devices, a function that has also been suggested for the Albertosaurids. If so, they may have been brightly colored or served as anchors for large feathers. Their hands could also have been used for signaling in general. While small, Tyrannosaurids had exceptional eyesight, as will be elaborated on later, so they would have been able to notice the relatively subtle hand movements of their peers. If they hunted in packs, this would have given the tyrants a way to communicate without alerting their prey. The main problem with this hypothesis is the limited mobility of Tyrannosaurid arms. Another hypothesis regarding their function is that the forelimbs help them to get up from a sitting position, but their restricted mobility would once again be a hindrance for such a task. Likewise, although stronger than the arms of most humans, Tyrannosaurid forelimbs were still too weak to have been much help lifting their own titanic bodies. On the other hand, Tyrannosaurid's shoulder muscles were not nearly so diminished as the arms themselves. While the arms were too short to capture their prey, they could have helped hold on to them after the jaws had already clamped down. This would explain why Tyrannosaurid claws were still built to pierce flesh. Supporting this, fractures have been found in the arm bones of the famous Tyrannosaurus specimen Sue, which seem to have been caused when struggling prey exceeded their strength, painfully tearing both bone and muscle. One advantage of this pinning strategy is that the force created as prey tried to escape wasn't concentrated entirely on the Tyrannosaurid's head and neck. This would have been all the more important, since most Tyrannosaurid skulls were not built for holding onto prey as those of Carnosaurs had been. However, once subdued, their primary pinning tool would have been their much stronger feet. Although Tyrannosaurid arms were shorter than those of most other theropods, their legs were much longer. While not as eye-catching as their robust skulls, or even their puny forelimbs, these long legs were a critical part of Tyrannosauridae's success. Besides serving to hold down prey and allowing for powerful kicks, they also possessed numerous cursorial adaptations, or those specialized for running, absent in their Carnosaurian predecessors. The length of the hind limbs was less extreme in large Tyrannosaurids, a necessary sacrifice to support their greater weight, but their adaptations for speed remain superior to those of Carnosaurs and Ceratosaurs. The Tyrannosaurus' propensity for speed can be seen in their smaller ancestors. For example, a ridge on the ilium, when served as an attachment point for powerful leg muscles, is a characteristic trait of Tyrannosauridea. Other cursorial adaptations only appear close to the base of Tyrannosauridae, perhaps since the Tyrannosauroids were growing in size and needed to compensate for their increased weight. One of these can be seen in their metatarsals, which are usually toe bones, but form the lower leg in theropods. Tyrannosaurids had an arctometatarsal, a peculiar structure where the middle metatarsal is compressed by the others. Arctometatarsals help to distribute the stress created from running more equally across the bones. The arctometatarsalian condition is found in other coelurosaurs, such as the Allosaurids, Troodontids, Ornithomimosaurs, and cynagnathid oviraptorosaurs. It was once proposed that they and the Tyrannosaurids belonged to the clade Arctometatarsalia, but since the earliest members of some of these subclades lack arctometatarsals, Arctometatarsalia is no longer considered valid. Instead, the condition appears to have evolved independently in most of these coelurosaurs. Species of all the other Arctometatarsalian theropods coexisted with the Tyrannosaurids, who seem to have developed their arctometatarsals somewhat later, so during their evolutionary arms race, the hunters may have developed similar solutions as the hunted. Because of these traits, during the 1990s and early 2000s, some paleontologists held that even the giant Tyrannosaurids were deceptively quick, which is how T-Rex was memorably portrayed in Jurassic Park. However, much like Arctometatarsalia, this has not stood the test of time. A paper published in 2002 found that Tyrannosaurus's leg muscles would not have been able to realistically produce enough force for it to run faster than 25 miles an hour. More recent papers have concluded that Tyrannosaurus moved even slower. Rather than looking at how much power its muscles could generate, one study instead focused on how much force its limb bones could withstand. These scientists found that due to its sheer size, T-Rex's long legs were too fragile for it to have moved at even half the speed theoretically possible from its massive leg muscles. Rather than helping it run faster, its elongated limbs ironically prevented the Tyrant King from safely assuming a running gait. That said, its top speed, 11 miles or 18 kilometers an hour, is more impressive than it sounds, as Tyrannosaurus could walk faster than most humans can run. Additionally, the scientists who calculated the 11 miles per hour estimate also noted that some of the soft tissue that wasn't included in their model may have cushioned Tyrannosaurus's limb bones, potentially allowing it to move slightly faster than their estimate. The other members of Tyrannosauridae, like Tarbosaurus, are thought to have also probably been restricted to a walking gait like Tyrannosaurus. It may not have just been the largest species whose speed was detrimentally affected by their size. A study conducted in 2020 found that the top speeds of animals that weigh above 1,000 kilograms, or 1 ton, are highly restricted due to their bulk. Crucially, the presence of cursorial adaptations does not raise the hard limit imposed by weight. Most adult Tyrannosaurids, even the relatively gracile Albertosaurines, weighed more than a ton, and while they could still run, they may not have been much faster than the Carnosaurs which lacked their extensive cursorial adaptations. This brings up the question of why they had them if they were seemingly useless for animals of their size. The answer is that, as mentioned at the beginning of the video, these traits were useful during their juvenile stage, as they weighed considerably less. Indeed, the cursorial traits of juvenile Tyrannosaurids are more pronounced than in adults. Their legs were even longer, and their femurs were proportionally shorter than their tibias, as in many other cursorial animals. Their torsos were also shorter and lighter, further reducing their overall weight. Even if some of them grew up into giants unable to truly run at all, juvenile Tyrannosaurids were among the fastest carnivorous dinosaurs. This was important both to catch other dinosaurs and to avoid becoming the prey of older Tyrannosaurids. In short, while adult Tyrannosaurids personified power, juveniles personified speed. For most of these youngsters, the only carnivorous dinosaurs that may have been able to run faster than them were not the famous Dromaeosaurids, but the aberrant Tyrannosaurids Asiatyrannus and Alioraminii. They remained under a ton even during adulthood, and were actually more lightly built than the juveniles of their larger cousins. If the large Tyrannosaurids were the Mesozoic lions, the smaller Alioramins were the cheetahs. They and the juveniles of other Tyrannosaurids are thought to have primarily preyed upon smaller, swifter dinosaurs, leaving the bigger, slower herbivores like ceratopsians and hadrosaurs to the larger tyrants. While not as fast as during their youth, adult Tyrannosaurids such as Daspletosaurus and even Tyrannosaurus are generally held to have still been faster than these dinosaurs. On the other hand, some studies have found that the Hadrosaur Edmontosaurus and the Tyrant King's famous foe Triceratops may have still been capable of outpacing it. The smaller juveniles of these species were almost certainly faster, which would have posed a problem since even predators as deadly as the Tyrannosaurids would have preferred to target them over the more dangerous adults. Furthermore, dinosaur juveniles made up a greater portion of the population compared to mammalian herbivores. A popular hypothesis is the Tyrannosaurids got around the limitations imposed by their massive size by hunting in mixed-age packs. The idea is the faster youngsters could have caught the prey, which was then subdued by the more powerful, older members of the pack. However, the presence of juveniles in these packs was not strictly necessary. By coordinating with each other, modern pack hunters are able to capture animals faster than any individual member. Even if hunting alone, the Tyrannosaurids had an advantage that may have prevented their prey from reaching their top speed before it was too late. In Jurassic Park, the arrival of Tyrannosaurus Rex was announced by loud footsteps and seismic waves, a grandiose entrance that would have made it too hard to catch anything. The feet of real Tyrannosaurs had evolved to allow them to stealthily approach their prey before revealing themselves. As in most other theropods, their feet were twice as long as they were wide. This shape muffled the seismic waves created in front of them, although the footsteps of a large Tyrannosaurid would have still been detectable from a distance of 25 meters. Fortunately, at least for them, the seismic waves produced by their footsteps wouldn't have increased in intensity as they came closer. The seismic waves created by a Gorgosaurus walking 25 meters away would have been perceived as about the same as one just 5 meters away, and if its prey couldn't see it, they likely wouldn't know they were in grave danger until it was too late. This unassuming method of avoiding detection is called seismic wave motion camouflage, and would have provided plenty of opportunities for Tyrannosaurids, big or small, to catch faster dinosaurs. Unlike many of the other adaptations mentioned so far, seismic wave motion camouflage was common across Theropoda, rather than a unique innovation of Tyrannosauridae. Theropods may have also had an endurance advantage over their prey. While taken to an extreme in Tyrannosaurid Skulls, hollow bones were present throughout their skeletons, and those of other theropods. Besides reducing their overall weight, many of these hollow spaces in the postcranial skeleton were filled by air sacs connected to a bird-like respiratory system, which are more efficient than those of both mammals and most other reptiles. As nearly all of the large herbivores in Late Cretaceous North America and Asia had less developed versions of this respiratory system, the Tyrannosaurids would have been able to run for longer. Additionally, even the largest Tyrannosaurids were able to turn remarkably quickly due to a combination of their relatively short bodies and powerful leg muscles. Although their agility naturally decreased as they grew, the giant Tarbosaurus was still able to turn twice as quickly as the smaller Carnosaur Sinraptor. This would have given even the slowest Tyrannosaurids the advantage when in dense environments, where faster animals couldn't reach their top speeds. Naturally, the more fleet-footed tyrants would have found such agility useful when pursuing other dinosaurs. The Tyrannosaur's ability to make rapid turns came at a cost, as it also made them less stable and easier for their foes to toss aside, which could explain the potential retention of their small arms as pinning tools. Another way for a Tyrannosaurid to catch faster dinosaurs was to lure them to the water. Tyrannosaurids were excellent swimmers, and would have been faster than most other dinosaurs when swimming or wading in shallow water. This environment would have allowed even a T-Rex to outpace ornithomimosaurs like Struthiomimus, who are generally regarded as the fastest runners within Dinosauria. What's more, when at a depth of 3.2 meters, adult Tyrannosaurus would have even been able to safely assume a running gait. Although it is important to clarify that in absolute terms, it would have been moving slower than when on land. Although many of their cursorial traits were little more than vestiges of their youth, some of them continue to prove useful during adulthood. For instance, the greater stride length created by their long hind limbs meant Tyrannosaurids spent less energy when walking, making it possible for them to patiently exhaust their prey before moving in for the kill. This more efficient form of traveling also made it easier for them to roam their vast territories in search of food, and the energy saved was the equivalent of several tons of meat each year. This more efficient form of foraging was complemented by their enhanced senses, the strongest of which was their sense of smell. Besides the enlarged olfactory region in their nasal cavities, scientists know this from studying their brains, or more accurately, their fossilized endocast. While these casts are obviously non-functioning, and much remains unknown about even living brains, different regions of the brain reliably correspond to different tasks. All Tyrannosaurids have enlarged olfactory bulbs, the part of the brain responsible for the sense of smell. This region is larger than in most dinosaurs, but is on par with modern vultures. Like them, Tyrannosaurids could have used their sensitive noses to track down food, living or dead, across their vast territory, complementing their superior roaming capabilities. Predators with enhanced olfactory abilities also tend to employ them to detect marked territory, which could have helped tyrant dinosaurs to avoid dangerous confrontations with rival carnivores, including those of the same species. A strong sense of smell is also useful in low light conditions. In the Tyrannosaurids case, they could have used it to locate their prey at night or while hiding in dense foliage to avoid detection, which they could navigate due to their surprisingly high agility. They could also get close to their victims with relative ease due to their seismic wave motion camouflage. Although the largest species of Tyrannosaurid were as big as an elephant, they were surprisingly well suited for stealth. While smell was a Tyrannosaurid's strongest sense, the region responsible for processing auditory information was also highly developed, and they had long coccular ducts in their inner ears, as in modern animals with acute hearing. Their shape is best suited for detecting low-frequency sounds, which was common among dinosaurs. Low frequencies travel further than high frequencies, so increased sensitivity to them would have made it even easier for the Tyrannosaurids to locate distant prey. The semicircular canals, which are used for balance, were also elongated. Their shape more closely matches that of small coelurosaurs than other large theropods like Carnosaurs or Albertosaurus. The length of semicircular canals may not seem like the most interesting of topics relating to these megacarnivores, but they would have given the Tyrannosaurids bird-like gaze stabilization, which would have proved critical for predators adapted to make quick, tight turns when pursuing prey. It wasn't just the obvious traits, like their teeth, that made the Tyrannosaurids such sophisticated killers. Tyrannosaurid optic lobes are smaller than both their olfactory bulbs and the region that processed auditory information, and were reduced relative to their smaller ancestors. That is not to say the late Cretaceous tyrants had poor eyesight. Indeed, even the most conservative estimates have concluded that they could see better than other large theropods, as well as humans. If the most optimistic estimates are accurate, then Tyrannosaurid eyesight was truly remarkable, and that of Tyrannosaurus rex itself may have been the best of any terrestrial animal. An eye's visual acuity is based more on absolute size than relative size. Although Tyrannosaurid eye sockets only occupied the upper portion of their often compressed orbits, they were still quite large. In Tyrannosaurus's case, its eyes are thought to have been the size of oranges, making them perhaps the largest eyes of any terrestrial animal. Although smaller in absolute terms, the orbits of Teratophoneus were proportionately larger than those of other tyrannosaurs. The eyes of Tyrannosaurid Juveniles may have occupied a larger portion of their more circular orbits, allowing them to possess large eyes despite their smaller body size. A major advantage found within some members of Tyrannosauridae was strong binocular vision. While the eyes of other large theropods were placed on the sides of their skulls, the eyes of the Tyrannosaurids were positioned to allow for greater overlap, something enabled by their wider skulls. Carnosaurs only had 20 degrees of binocular vision, and the Albertosaurine Tyrannosaurids were not much better off, but Daspletosaurus had 35 degrees of binocular vision. The binocular vision of Lythronax, Tarbosaurus, and especially Tyrannosaurus were even better, with T-Rex possessing 55 degrees of binocular vision, greater than that of a hawk. The depth perception granted by binocular vision allowed them to better judge the distance between themselves and potential prey, and to better avoid obstacles while chasing them. Binocular vision also makes it easier to detect camouflaged creatures, or objects that aren't moving. Suffice to say, the idea popularized by Jurassic Park that T-Rex wouldn't see something if it wasn't moving is fiction. The paleontologist behind the study of theropod depth perception, Dr. Kent A. Stevens, even said it was this absurd notion from Jurassic Park which inspired him to see what Tyrannosaurus's vision was actually like. In addition to their greater binocular vision, Tyrannosaurid orbits also became increasingly elevated over the course of their evolution. This served to reduce how much of their field of vision was taken up by their own snouts and lacrimal horns. While Tyrannosaurid eyesight was good, without an actual eye, it is impossible to determine just how good it was. The lower estimates are based on essentially scaling up crocodilian eyes. Crocodilians are the closest living relatives of the dinosaurs, and have sacrificed some of their visual acuity in favor of better night vision, so this method is unlikely to overestimate the capabilities of the Tyrannosaurids. The highest figures cited for them are instead based on scaling up the eyes of hawks. As far-roaming predators, and actual Coelurosaurian dinosaurs, the comparison fits surprisingly well. A hawkeye scaled up to the size of Tyrannosaurus's would have 3 times the visual acuity, and 13 times that of a human. Additionally, T-Rex's limiting farpoint, the distance it could distinguish objects from the horizon, could have been as high as 6 kilometers, or a little over 3.5 miles. As for whether the eyes of Tyrannosaurs were more like those of hawks or crocodilians, the shape of their optic lobes are intermediate between those of birds and other reptiles. However, bird brains changed extensively to handle the challenges of flight, so some of the differences between them may merely be the result of birds needing to handle moving through the air rather than representing a difference in visual acuity. While there remain many unknowns, comparisons of Tyrannosaurids with nocturnal dinosaurs, like Allosaurids, suggest they were primarily diurnal, adapted towards hunting during the day. Therefore, their eyes were likely built more like a hawk's than a crocodile's. While there's only limited information available regarding the sense of taste in Tyrannosaurids, there is more than in most other non-avian dinosaurs. Analysis of a Tarbosaurus skull found that it had space for a large glossophagnarial nerve, which is responsible for the sensory information in the mouth, suggesting Tyrannosaurids had an excellent sense of taste. There was some research suggesting that Tyrannosaurids had a type of sensory organ otherwise only found in crocodilians and their relatives. When examining the foramina, or small openings, on Tyrannosaurid snouts, some paleontologists thought they were similar to those of crocodilians. They hold the nerves which connect to integumentary sense organs, or ISOs for short. These are the tiny black dots on crocodilian scales, which are primarily used to detect movement in the water, but they also make their snouts more sensitive. In Tyrannosaurids, it was thought they used sensors similar to ISOs to detect nest temperature, to safely handle eggs, to nuzzle mates, and employ finer movements when biting. However, the foramina of Tyrannosaurids are fewer in number than those of crocodilians. Some were instead likely used to support lips, while others may have supported keratinous pads to ornament the skull. ISOs also weren't present in the last common ancestor of dinosaurs and crocodilians, and only first appeared in semi-aquatic forms. However, the space for the opening containing the trigomenial nerve, the cranial nerve responsible for most sensors on the snout, was large in Tyrannosaurids, so their snouts may have still possessed greater sensitivity, even if it wasn't on par with crocodilians. Overall, the enhanced sensory abilities of the tyrant dinosaurs proved to be equally important towards their success as their bone-crushing jaws. With access to Tyrannosaurid endocast, this brings up the question of just how intelligent the Tyrant King and the rest of its dynasty were. Relative to their size, the Tyrannosaurids had some of the largest brains of any group of dinosaurs. Despite its brutish appearance, Tyrannosaurus's brain was the proportionately largest among the tyrants, although those of the other Tyrannosaurids weren't far behind. Despite the uncertainty regarding whether or not Bistahioversor was an actual Tyrannosaurid, the shape of his brain was at least similar to them. Tyrannosaurid encephalization quotients, a measure of relative brain size, are equivalent to those of chimpanzees. This doesn't mean they were as smart as chimpanzees, as the encephalization quotients of reptiles and mammals are calculated differently. Instead, it means the difference between the size of Tyrannosaurid brains and the brains of an average reptile is the same as the difference between a chimpanzee and the average mammal, which tend to be smarter than reptiles. The only dinosaurs with brains as large or larger relative to body size belong to Maniraptoriformes, the branch of Coelurosauria that includes birds. Maniraptoriforms with proportionately larger brains include the Troodontids and the Ornithomimids. On the other hand, Carnosaur brains were only about 2/3 the size of Tyrannosaurid brains. In contrast to older depictions, the Tyrannosaurids were probably the smartest apex predators of the entire Mesozoic era. Still, their intellectual capabilities have sometimes been overestimated. A recent study claimed that Tyrannosaurus was as intelligent as a baboon, and even suggested it may have employed tool use. The study was based on the premise that intelligence is based on absolute neuron count in the forebrain, the portion responsible for most cognition functions and processing sensory information. The actual correlation between the two is weak, and papers written in response to it have found numerous other flaws in the original's mythology. The brains of most dinosaurs did not fill the entire endocranial cavity, something that was not taken into account. It also assumed the brains of theropods, like Tyrannosaurus, had a similar morphology and neuron density as birds. However, the shapes of Tyrannosaurid endocast have much more in common with crocodilians, with much of the expanded regions being related to their enhanced senses. Correcting for errors in the original paper, another found that Tyrannosaurid forebrains didn't have as many neurons as baboons, regardless of whether or not they were assumed to have the neuron density of a bird or a non-avian reptile. Despite the image created by Jurassic Park, even the most intelligent non-avian dinosaurs appear to have only been as smart as the least intelligent modern birds. The Tyrannosaurids almost certainly did not approach the level of primates, and their cognition seems to have had more in common with crocodilians than birds. Of course, the intelligence of crocodilians has also been underestimated. Ironically, even possible tool use has been reported in alligators, who have been observed placing sticks in their mouths as lures for nest-building birds. Therefore, while unlikely, the idea of tool-using tyrants may not be so far-fetched after all. While the Tyrannosaurids were among the most powerful and sophisticated large predators evolution has ever produced, their future would not have been apparent when looking at the first Tyrannosaurids. They lacked most of the traits that set Tyrannosauridae apart, appearing much as other basal coelurosaurs. Before the rise of the Tyrannosaurids, most tyrannosaurs were small carnivores, while carnosaurs served as the predominant apex predators. Early tyrannosauroids were typically as tall as a person's hips, with a length between 2 to 3 meters. Unlike their descendants, the skeletons of the first tyrannosaurs were not built for power, while their tails were longer and thinner. The skulls of these little tyrants were much more delicate than those of their bone-shattering successors. Their arms were long and had 3 fingers, which could have been used to grab hold of small prey. The endocast of basal tyrannosauroids also lacked the increased relative size of the later tyrants. Some early tyrannosaurs like Guanlong also had large, showy crests on their heads. These were tall but thin, and ran along their skulls much like the crest of earlier theropods like Dilophosaurus. Besides being used to attract mates, simulations using finite element analysis suggest that these large crests also served as stress sinks. The fragile crest of basal tyrannosauroids would have been a liability when attacking animals of comparable or greater size, which is why this adaptation for allowing a more powerful bite was not inherited by the Tyrannosaurids, and why their display function was replaced by more subtle headgear. Still, even the earliest tyrants shared plenty of traits with the terrors of the Late Cretaceous. While not bone crushers, they already possessed the D-shaped premaxillary teeth. The premaxilla itself was tall and blunt, the nasals fused, and their skulls slightly larger than those of other coelurosaurs, providing the foundation for the development of the bulkier skulls of their tyrannosaurid descendants. The hips of early tyrannosauroids also already had additional muscle attachment points, allowing for them to run faster than other small theropods, although they did not yet possess either arctometatarsos or the exceptionally long hind limbs of the Tyrannosaurids. The oldest known tyrannosauroids, Proceratosaurus and Qianzhousaurus, lived about 166 million years ago during the Middle Jurassic. This was 80 million years before the first known Tyrannosaurids, and 100 million years before the climatic end of the clade. Before the emergence of the Tyrannosaurids, Tyrannosauroids were actually more widespread. Their fossils are primarily found in the northern continents of North America, Asia, and Europe, which had once formed the supercontinent of Laurasia. Some theropod fossils from the southern Gondwanan continents of South America and Australia have also been assigned to Tyrannosauroidea, but they are fragmentary, and not all scientists agree on their classification. Some tyrannosauroids from the early Cretaceous, such as the British Eotyrannus and the Chinese Zhongguanlong, display more similarities with the Tyrannosaurids. They were medium-sized predators between 4 to 5 meters long, and about as tall as the average person, so about on par with Asiatyrannus. These larger tyrannosauroids also had more elongated hind limbs than earlier species like Guanlong. One of these more derived tyrannosaurs, the Central Asian Timurlangia, also had a more tyrannosaurid-like brain and elongated coccular ducts. There is some variation among these medium-sized tyrants. For instance, while Eotyrannus had a stouter skull, Zhongguanlong instead evolved a long, narrow snout, which would be repeated in the Alioramans. This illustrates how this intermediate grade of Tyrannosaurus was more than a step leading up to T-Rex, being a diverse lineage of theropods that came to occupy a number of different niches. How these medium-sized tyrants replaced the Carnosaurs as the top predators remains poorly understood. While the Campanian and Maastrichtian ages are well represented in the fossil record, dinosaur fossils from the Middle Cretaceous are rare, and complete skeletons even more so. This has left major gaps in Tyrannosauroidea's evolutionary history, particularly in the line leading to the Tyrannosaurids. For years, the fossil record showed giant Carcharodontosaurid carnosaurs on top, with small to medium-sized tyrannosaurs beneath them. Then, tens of millions of years later, the carnosaurs are gone, and traditional tyrannosaurids are the top apex predators, with nothing in between. There is a little more to go on now, and one thing that is clear is that, despite previous simplistic assumptions, the Tyrannosaurids were not the first tyrants to evolve large body size. The Tyrannosaurid Qianzhousaurus from Middle Jurassic Siberia was already over 5 meters long, potentially exceeding the size of the Tyrannosaurid Asiatyrannus, but still smaller than the rest of Tyrannosauridae. The early Cretaceous Tyrannosauroids Sinotyrannus and Eutyrannus grew to sizes comparable to those of Albertosaurine Tyrannosaurids, despite living about 120 million years ago. These giant Tyrannosauroids seem to have replaced the local carnosaurs in eastern Asia, but they were not the ancestors of the Tyrannosaurids. They occupy a more basal position within Tyrannosauroidea than Eotyrannus and the other medium-sized tyrants, and they seem to have been evolutionary dead ends. The hind limb length of Eutyrannus, which is known from complete skeletons, is intermediate between those of carnosaurs and Tyrannosaurids. It also had a lacrimal horn more reminiscent of the Late Cretaceous tyrannosaurs than the crest of more basal species. However, the teeth and claws of Sinotyrannus and Eutyrannus are closer to those of the carnosaurs they replaced than Tyrannosaurids. There may have been another, more widespread lineage of large tyrannosauroids before the demise of the Carcharodontosaurid carnosaurs and the rise of the Tyrannosaurids. Named Megaraptora, the identity of these theropods has been enigmatic for some time. They were once considered carnosaurs closely related to the Carcharodontosaurids, but an increasing number of paleontologists instead hold that the Megaraptorans were actually tyrannosauroids closely related to the Tyrannosaurids. Ironically, besides their large body size, the Megaraptorans were almost the opposite of the Tyrannosaurids. They had lightly built, elongated skulls, and powerful arms equipped with massive claws. Although they seem to have been locally extinct in North America and Asia during the reign of the Tyrannosaurids, Megaraptorans could still be found alongside the Albertosaurus in the southern hemisphere all the way to the end of the Cretaceous period. One of the largest known predators in North America leading up to the emergence of Tyrannosauridae was Ceots, who has traditionally been classified as a carnosaur. However, more recent research has suggested a potential Tyrannosauroid identity for this theropod, so at least some of the predators the Tyrannosaurids replaced may have been fellow Tyrannosauroids. Either way, while it is still uncertain how they rose to the top, it is suspected to be the result of the Cenomanian-Turonian extinction, which transpired about 94 million years ago. Like the rest of the Middle Cretaceous, this extinction event is poorly understood, but it is thought to have been caused by volcanism and rising sea levels. While not as severe as the extinction that would wipe out all non-avian dinosaurs nearly 30 million years later, the Cenomanian-Turonian extinction event appears to have spelled the doom of the Carcharodontosaurids, the northern Megaraptorans, as well as the Spinosaurids and many sauropods. The small tyrannosauroid Susquityrannus is the oldest tyrannosaur found after this extinction event. It lived 90 million years ago during the Turonian Age alongside the ancestors of favored prey of the Tyrannosaurids, including Zuniceratops, the first ceratopsian to obtain large body size and brow horns, as well as Jaywati, a close relative of the future hadrosaurs. Susquityrannus itself is only known from immature specimens, but examination of their bone histology indicates they were not the offspring of giants. The Asian Electrosaurus may date to the same time, but as mentioned earlier, the age of its fossils and its relationship to Tyrannosauridae are currently a mystery. Unfortunately, there are few fossils from the following two ages, the Santonian and Konanakian, so what came next has to be reconstructed from the closest relatives of the Tyrannosaurids. The large tyrannosauroids that rose from the ashes of the Cenomanian-Turonian extinction event form the clade Eutyrannosauria, which consists of the Appalachian tyrants and Tyrannosauridae. Species whose placement within Tyrannosauridae is uncertain, such as Bistahioversor, are at the very least Eutyrannosaurs. The Eutyrannosaur Dryptosaurus was about 7.5 meters long, a bit smaller than most Tyrannosaurids, but firmly an apex predator. This Appalachian tyrant had arctometatarsalia feet and smaller arms than earlier Tyrannosauroids, although they were still larger than those of Tyrannosaurids and may have retained 3 fingers. Dryptosaurus's lightly built skull and teeth were also not built for crushing bone. The other Appalachian tyrant known from diagnostic remains is Appalachiosaurus. The holotype is 6.5 meters long, but belongs to a juvenile. The Appalachian tyrants do not form a clade with each other, as Appalachiosaurus is more closely related to the Tyrannosaurids than it is to Dryptosaurus, to the extent that it was originally mistaken for an Albertosaurian Tyrannosaurid. Its skull was powerfully built, but its more elongated shape was still less sturdy than those of the bone-crushing Tyrannosaurids. Some reconstructions portray Appalachiosaurus with arms longer than those of the more basal Dryptosaurus and even the Megaraptorans, but this was based on a pubis, a pelvic bone that was misidentified as a humerus. The one shown here is likely more accurate. Predators like these two tyrannosaurs seem to have been the norm across North America for about the first 10 million years after the start of the Turonian Age. Then, sea levels changed, and North America was divided in two. The eastern half became Appalachia, while the western half became Laramidia. It was here that an isolated lineage of eutyrannosaurs finally gave rise to the true Tyrannosaurids. The formation of land bridges enabled the Tyrannosaurids to conquer Asia, replacing whatever large carnivores lived there previously, although some of these smaller tyrannosaurs there, such as the Alioramans, may instead represent a separate lineage of indigenous eutyrannosaurs. As for the Appalachian tyrants, for most of Tyrannosauridae's existence, the two halves of North America remained separate, so species like Appalachiosaurus continued to terrorize the east, while Tyrannosaurids terrorized the west. However, they became rejoined during the late Maastrichtian. It is difficult to rule out the possibility of Tyrannosaurids spreading east during this time, since Appalachian dinosaur fossils are less common than those from Laramidia. At a minimum, their less derived cousins weren't outright replaced by Tyrannosaurus, since the basal eutyrannosaur Dryptosaurus lived during this time. Likewise, the controversial Nanotyrannus may be a descendant of one of these Appalachian tyrants who spread west, or an Asian eutyrannosaur who spread from the east. Of course, given the sparse fossil record during the Middle Cretaceous and in Late Cretaceous Appalachia, science's understanding of the rise of the Tyrannosaurids is likely to continue to change over time. Tyrannosaurid integument, or their outer covering, is a topic where the scientific consensus has also remained far from static. While extensive skin impressions have been found on some dinosaurs, like hadrosaurs, the Tyrannosaurids are not among them, so reconstructing this part of Tyrannosaurid anatomy has been based primarily on their relatives. For most of the century following the discovery of Tyrannosaurus rex, Tyrannosaurids were reconstructed with scales, which were thought to be the universal integument of all dinosaurs. During the dinosaur renaissance, some scientists suspected that some dinosaurs closely related to birds may have had feathers, which was confirmed by the discovery of feathered dinosaur fossils in China during the late 1990s. All of these feathered dinosaurs initially belonged to Coelurosauria, and some, like Sinosauropteryx, were more distantly related to birds than the Tyrannosaurids were, all but proving they were present in their ancestors. This was once again confirmed in 2004, which saw the discovery of the feathered Tyrannosaurid Dilong. It was a small, basal member of the group from early Cretaceous China. Many paleontologists were still leery of the idea of feathered Tyrannosaurids, as they thought that feathers may have been lost in larger species, much like how most large mammals are largely hairless. This was challenged by the discovery of Eutyrannus in 2012. Its body size was on par with some Tyrannosaurids, and much like Dilong, Eutyrannus was extensively feathered. Eutyrannus demonstrated that feathers were present in the ancestors of the Tyrannosaurids, and that large size and extensive feathers were not mutually exclusive. In the years following its discovery, reconstructing Tyrannosaurids with feathers became common. Tyrannosaurid feathers were not the complex, pennaceous feathers of birds, which originated in the Maniraptoriforms. They were instead simple filaments similar to the down of bird chicks. Yet the Tyrannosaurids may not have had even these primitive feathers. Although there are no extensive preserved Tyrannosaurid scale impressions, a few small patches of scales have been found. Some feathered dinosaurs have a mixture of feathers and scales, so individually these patches don't disprove the idea of fluffy Tyrannosaurids. However, if a composite is made of all the scale impressions found across all Tyrannosaurid genera, they cover most regions of the body. These scales are generally small and polygonal, with those from the large Tyrannosaurians being smaller than those found in other species. During the late 2000s, the idea of predominantly scaly Coelurosaurs would have seemed strange, but as it turns out, primitive feathers don't seem to have been unique to the Coelurosaurs, or even theropods. Similar feathers have also been found in ornithischian dinosaurs, including those related to hadrosaurs, who are known from specimens with preserved scale impressions covering nearly the entire body. Likewise, primitive feathers have also been found in pterosaurs, close relatives of the dinosaurs. Thermodynamic models of early dinosaurs found that most of them would have required feathers just to survive, but this didn't apply to larger, derived species like the sauropod relative Plateosaurus. This is because their original purpose is thought to have been as thermal insulation. Unlike crocodilians and lizards, dinosaurs were endotherms, which means they produced their own body heat. This came with a lot of advantages, allowing them to grow quicker, be more active, and to thrive in climates too cold for ectotherms. The cost of such high metabolisms is that they consume vast amounts of energy, to the extent that ectothermic predators can sustain themselves on just a fraction of what equally sized endotherms require. One way to reduce the energy demands of a high metabolism is by insulating the body, such as with feathers, to slow down how quickly the heat it produces is lost to the environment. The smaller an animal is, the quicker it loses heat due to its higher surface to area volume ratio. Since the first dinosaurs were small, active creatures, it should be a little surprised that they needed feathers. Large animals have the opposite problem. They have difficulty losing heat quickly enough to avoid overheating, so large coats of feathers or fur shift from a necessity to a liability. This is presumably why the Tyrannosaurids returned to a predominantly scaly integument. Of course, this brings up the question of why Eutyrannus, which overlapped in size with the Tyrannosaurids, was able to retain its feathery coat. Part of the answer is the climate. Thermal insulation remains important for large animals in colder environments, where heat is lost more quickly. Despite the tropical image most people have of the Mesozoic era, the environment this feathered tyrant lived in had an average temperature of only 10 degrees Celsius, or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, with winters cold enough for it to snow. Additionally, the Yishan Formation Eutyrannus was found in was once a forest, which would have provided ample shade. Although Tyrannosaurids don't appear to have had predominantly feathery coats, that doesn't mean they were entirely scaly either. As mentioned earlier, other dinosaurs have been found with a mixture of feathers and scales, a condition that applies to even modern birds. Furthermore, while similarly sized herbivorous dinosaurs from the same climates, like hadrosaurs, were almost or entirely covered in scales, theropods had higher metabolic rates than them, so they would have had greater reason to retain some feathers. Patches of feathers could have also been used as display devices to attract mates. Feathers may have also been present in the scaly patches, occupying the gaps between their non-overlapping scales. Evidence of feathers is less likely to be preserved than evidence of scales, so this would explain their absence in the limited Tyrannosaurid skin impressions. It is also important to keep in mind that not all Tyrannosaurids were the same, and their integument may have varied between species. The climates they lived in ranged from tropical to within the Arctic Circle. In the case of the polar Qianzhousaurus, although the far north wasn't nearly as cold as today, this Tyrannosaurid still lived in a climate where cool summers and frigid winters were the norm. Since none of the Tyrannosaurid scale impressions belonged to this genus, Qianzhousaurus could have been as fluffy as Eutyrannus. This presumption has been heightened due to its presumed status as a dwarf, although as mentioned earlier, more recent research indicates Qianzhousaurus was the same size as most other Tyrannosaurids. The members of Albertosaurinae may have also had more feathers than other Tyrannosaurids on account of their smaller sizes and more gracile builds. However, entirely feathery coats are all but disproven, since both Albertosaurus and Gorgosaurus are among the species with preserved scale impressions. With that said, they remain plausible for the smaller and lither Alioramans and Asiatyrannus. On the other hand, Tyrannosaurus is the least likely to have had a feathery coat. Most of the scale impressions come from it and the closely related Tarbosaurus. Its massive size and bulky, compact body would have made it particularly vulnerable to overheating, perhaps more so than any other theropod. Modern elephants have risen to the same challenge by evolving massive ears, which increase their surface area and thus reduce the time it takes to cool off. There are claims of a flap of skin preserved under the jaws of Tarbosaurus, which formed a wattle like those in some birds. This structure could have likewise been used to increase its surface area. However, it is important to keep in mind that the relevant specimen remains undescribed. While adults were too large to have extensive feathery coats, the same was not true of Tyrannosaurid Juveniles. It has been speculated that young tyrannosaurs may have been covered in feathers even if the adults shifted to a predominantly scaly integument. Given their small size and high metabolisms, such thermal insulation may have been outright necessary for them to even survive their younger years. The main argument against this is that no other animals are known to experience such a drastic change in their integument as they mature. However, in recent years, some small dinosaurs thought to be coelurosaurs have turned out to be young carnosaurs, and these baby dinosaurs had feathers. Most of these large theropods would have faced the same evolutionary pressure to lose their feathery coats as the Tyrannosaurids, creating some precedent for such a change. It would still be dramatic, but dramatic changes were normal for Tyrannosaurids as they grew. Furthermore, it may not have been too hard for feathers to change to scales as the tyrants matured. While feathers are essentially modified scales, bird scales are feathers that have been modified back to their original shape. The expression of the gene responsible for this would merely need to change during the juvenile Tyrannosaurid's development. Indeed, there are enough similarities between Tyrannosaurid and bird scales that they may both be modified feathers. The teeth of Tyrannosaurids and other large theropods have traditionally been portrayed as exposed, as in crocodilians. More recent research supports the idea that they were instead entirely covered by lizard-like lips. As mentioned earlier, Tyrannosaurid snouts have small openings called foramina, which house blood vessels. The number and position of these foramina closely matches those of reptiles that use them to support lips. The main function of lips is to keep the teeth wet, as dry teeth are more susceptible to wear. Crocodiles don't need lips since they are semi-aquatic, and therefore are able to regularly hydrate their teeth by simply relying on their external environment. Even so, crocodilian teeth exhibit greater wear than those of other reptiles. This pattern is not seen in Tyrannosaurids, despite their teeth being otherwise more vulnerable to such wear. While thicker than the teeth of most other theropods, they were more compressed than the conical teeth of crocodilians, and had a thinner coat of enamel. Tyrannosaurid teeth also had a slower rate of replacement than crocodilian teeth, so it is doubtful they could have been maintained in such good condition without lips. One argument for at least partial exposure has been that the teeth of Tyrannosaurids were so long they would have poked out of any lips. However, even lizards with proportionately larger teeth, like the crocodile monitor, are able to cover them entirely with lips. The evidence for lips also extends to other theropods, and even distant relatives of crocodilians, such as Postosuchus. This reptile was once mistaken as an ancestor of the Tyrannosaurids, but was instead one of the top predators during the Triassic period, before dinosaurs rose to the top of the food chain. While impressive in their own right, all but the smallest Tyrannosaurids exceeded them in size, and a few species were among the largest terrestrial predators the world has yet seen. Yet when they first entered the world, Tyrannosaurids were tiny, and thus vulnerable. Unlike most mammals, which can give birth to relatively large young, dinosaurs hatched from eggs, which greatly constrained the potential size of their offspring. Tyrannosaurids had the largest eggs of any other dinosaurs, with the exception of the recently extinct elephant birds, but this still created a massive size disparity between the hatchlings and multi-ton adults. Based on fragmentary fossils of embryonic Tyrannosaurids, their eggs are thought to have been 17 inches, or about 45 centimeters long, while the baby tyrants appear to have been nearly a meter long when they hatched. Predators that would have otherwise been too small to be considered even a snack for an adult Tyrannosaurid would have found their hatchlings to be easy prey. The nest of other large dinosaurs contained numerous eggs, indicating they compensated for the high mortality rate of their offspring through sheer numbers. This is true even in dinosaurs that are known to have taken care of their offspring, such as the hadrosaur Maiasaura, so the same was likely true of the Tyrannosaurids. Although it is yet to be proven that Tyrannosaurids took care of their young, parental care was common with extinct and extant members of Dinosauria. It is also exhibited by the closely related crocodilians, so this behavior was almost certainly present in the first dinosaurs, meaning the most fearsome predators of the age of reptiles may have been good parents. The locations of all the, admittedly meager, Tyrannosaurid embryos were inland environments far from water. The sites in question also happen to contain the eggs of other large dinosaurs, including the previously mentioned Maiasaura. no eggshells have been found associated with the embryonic Tyrannosaurid fossils. So contrary to what's traditionally been expected of dinosaurs, it appears the tyrants laid soft-shelled eggs. Soft-shelled eggs have recently been identified in the ceratopsian Protoceratops and the basal sauropodomorph Moosaurus. They were also present in the pterosaurs, so the idea that Tyrannosaurid eggs had soft shells is not as aberrant as previously thought. However, Tyrannosaurus bones have been found containing medullary tissue, which bird mothers deposit to store the calcium needed to lay hard-shelled eggs. Therefore, the types of eggs laid by the members of Tyrannosauridae may have varied within the clade. Exactly what young Tyrannosaurids looked like during their first few years is unclear, as their fossils are rare, and none from this stage are anywhere close to complete, but the skeletons of older juveniles have helped to fill in the gaps. In Jurassic Park, the young Tyrannosaurus, nicknamed the Fawn, wasn't just a miniature version of the adults. This was also true of real Tyrannosaurids, although they didn't resemble the Fawn either. Instead, they more closely resembled the older juveniles, but the differences from the adults were even more extreme, with them possessing even more delicate skulls, longer legs, and even lighter builds. During their first few years, Tyrannosaurids resembled their basal ancestors like Suskityrannus and Guanlong, which is why the 3-year-old Raptor X holotype was mistaken for a basal Tyrannosauroid, albeit one transitional to the more familiar Tyrannosaurids. Science has a very good understanding of what older juvenile Tyrannosaurids looked like, as substantial juvenile remains are known from Tyrannosaurus, Tarbosaurus, Albertosaurus, Gorgosaurus, and Teratophoneus, while no specimens of Alioramus belong to adults. Over 1,800 differences between adult and juvenile Tyrannosaurus have been recorded by paleontologist Dr. Thomas Carr. Juveniles and adults were so different from each other that they could be, and have been, mistaken for separate species. In some cases, like the infamous Nanotyrannus, there is still no consensus. That Tyrannosaurids underwent dramatic morphological changes when growing should not be surprising, given the extreme size difference between the tiny hatchlings and the adults, which were some of the largest terrestrial carnivores. There was once a misconception among paleontologists that the juveniles of all Tyrannosaurids looked almost identical to each other, with most of the differences between them only emerging in adulthood. It is now known that many of the diagnostic traits of the adults could also be found in the juveniles. For instance, Tarbosaurus's proportionately shorter arms were already present in its juvenile form. Likewise, Alioramans, and to a lesser extent Albertosaurines, were more gracile than other Tyrannosaurids of the same age or size. In contrast, the skulls of Tyrannosaurus juveniles were instead wider than those of other species, reflecting the adult condition. This gave it a stronger bite at an earlier age. The source of this misconception was a juvenile Gorgosaurus skeleton that was misidentified as a Daspletosaurus. As of right now, Daspletosaurus's ontogeny, or development, is poorly understood, with the only juvenile specimens being an isolated postorbital and dentary. Although Tyrannosaurid parents may have protected and supported their offspring during their first few perilous years, after this point, Tyrannosaurid juveniles were capable of hunting other dinosaurs. As mentioned earlier, in some species they may have worked together in mixed-age packs. Others appear to have undergone ontogenetic niche shift, meaning they filled multiple niches throughout their lifespans. While rare among mammals and birds, this life strategy is common among other reptiles. For instance, crocodilian hatchlings start out as small insectivores, and as they grow, they add bigger prey such as crustaceans and small fish to their diets, and eventually graduate to hunting large mammals. Ontogenetic niche shift seems to have been the norm among large, non-avian dinosaurs, which is why they are less taxonomically diverse than comparable mammals. Since a single species of large dinosaur occupied multiple niches throughout its lifespan, this reduced the number available for small and medium-sized species. In the case of the Tyrannosaurids, their hatchlings didn't just look similar to their smaller ancestors. They are thought to have filled similar niches, which would explain the disappearance of the smaller Tyrannosauroids during the Late Cretaceous. As mentioned before, the older juveniles are thought to have filled the role of medium-sized predators, once again replacing more basal Tyrannosauroids like Eotyrannus. The stomach contents of a juvenile Gorgosaurus consist of small dinosaurs, and this is thought to have been the norm among juvenile tyrants. Their gracile jaws were not yet powerful enough to take on prey larger than themselves, but they were more than sufficient to dispatch the smaller animals too fast to be caught by the bulkier adults. Predators are expected to shift to hunting prey as large as themselves once they weigh at least 32 kilograms, or about 70 pounds. This shift seems to have been delayed in the Tyrannosaurids, as the juvenile Gorgosaurus was an order of magnitude larger than this when it died. The acid wear of the two small dinosaurs found inside its belly is different from each other, so they were likely caught and eaten at separate times, suggesting juvenile Tyrannosaurids still prefer to hunt smaller animals. Tyrannosaurids don't appear to have regularly hunted large herbivores until they reached the subadult stage. This is when their skulls shifted from their low, shallow shape to the deeper, wider skulls of adults, and when they acquired their robust, bone-shattering teeth. Subadults remained fairly fast and agile, although this was less pronounced in the larger Tyrannosaurus subadults. While juvenile Tyrannosaurids were perfectly capable of killing medium-sized animals, most of the medium-sized herbivores in their ecosystems were the juveniles of large species. They typically lived in herds, where they were guarded by the more formidable adults. The juveniles of some hadrosaurs, such as Hypacrosaurus, lived separately from the adults, but this seems to have been the exception across Late Cretaceous Laramidia and Asia. The Tyrannosaurids were not the only theropods whose juveniles filled the role of medium-sized predator. Such behavior seems to have been standard among carnosaurs and ceratosaurs. However, the life cycles of the Tyrannosaurids were exceptional even among other dinosaurs. The ecosystems dominated by other large theropods, like the carnosaurs, were also home to adult medium-sized carnivores, such as Ceratosaurus and some of the basal Tyrannosauroids. In contrast, at least in North America, juvenile Tyrannosaurids seem to have entirely replaced all other medium-sized carnivorous dinosaurs. In some ecosystems, like those dominated by Tyrannosaurus rex, every single medium and large-sized predator niche was simultaneously occupied by a single species of tyrant. If mammalian ecosystems were built the same, the largest predators in the African savannas after lions would be foxes. With this in mind, the importance of the Tyrannosaurids in their ecosystems was far greater than any mammalian predator or any other theropod. Recent research by paleontologist Dr. Andrea Cao has proposed a cause for the divergent life strategies of North American Tyrannosaurids from other dinosaurian apex predators. As alluded to earlier, he found that small, basal coelurosaurs assigned to the subclade Compsognathidae appear to be misclassified carnosaur hatchlings. They were adapted to hunt on their own, and seem to have been small generalists. Much as juvenile Tyrannosaurids replaced the medium-sized predators, the young carnosaurs appear to have replaced the small, basal theropods prevalent during the early Jurassic. Mid-sized juvenile carnosaurs were less divergent from adult forms, which tended to be more specialized. This allowed for a greater diversity of large to medium-sized carnivores in a single ecosystem. On the other hand, tyrant hatchlings were just a small part of a much more diverse assortment of small carnivores, while older life stages were better able to monopolize the larger niches. As a side note, it appears the first coelurosaurs were the pedomorphic descendants of carnosaurs, meaning they retained juvenile features and small size into adulthood. Therefore, the Tyrannosaurids may be the distant descendants of carnosaur-like theropods, although any species more closely related to the coelurosaurs than to Allosaurus would technically be outside of Carnosauria proper. In Asia, things were more complicated. The juveniles of large tyrannosaurs like Tarbosaurus followed the same life strategy as their North American cousins, but they also coexisted with medium-sized tyrannosaurs like the Alioramans, Asia Tyrannus, and perhaps Electrosaurus. They were able to coexist since all the small tyrants were more lightly built than the equally sized juveniles of the large predators, allowing them to divide their ecosystem's prey between themselves, which is called niche partitioning. A similar arrangement may have existed between Tyrannosaurus and the purported Nanotyrannus and Stegovenator. In any event, it is notable that all the medium-sized tyrannosaurs have only been found in ecosystems home to the particularly large and robust Tyrannosaurians, but not those that were home to the smaller, less specialized Tyrannosaurids like Daspletosaurus or the Albertosaurines. As endotherms, Tyrannosaurids were able to grow much faster than most other reptiles. This growth is recorded inside their bones, which contain, presumably annual, growth rings. From these, their age and growth rates can be determined. They grew slowest as hatchlings, which could have been the result of parental care reducing the need to grow quickly, but could have also been the result of malnutrition from having to live and hunt on their own. Tyrannosaurids outgrew all other contemporary predatory theropods by age 2, while the juvenile stage lasted until age 13 in Tyrannosaurus. This stage is sometimes claimed to have been even longer, but this is because of it being conflated with the subadult stage. It was during the subadult stage that Tyrannosaurids experienced a massive 4-year growth spurt. Growth slowed down again in T-Rex at age 18, which marked the start of the young adult stage, and it almost ceased entirely by age 22. The growth rate of Tyrannosaurus was comparable to that of modern elephants. In contrast, the ectothermic crocodilian Dinosuchus, which grew to a similar size, took almost 35 years to reach adulthood. There was some variability in how other Tyrannosaurids grew. For instance, in Asia Tyrannus, the smallest Tyrannosaurid, the phase of rapid, exponential growth had ended by around age 13, the same age this phase started in the larger T-Rex. Yet despite an adult T-Rex weighing 3 times as much as many of its relatives, it only took it a few additional years to reach adulthood, and the massive growth spurt lasted just as long in the rest of Tyrannosauridae. T-Rex primarily achieved its greater size by increasing its growth rate, rather than by extending the duration of its growth. This meant a juvenile Tyrannosaurus was always larger than any other Tyrannosaurid of equal age, although it didn't come to exceed the size of the larger adult forms until its growth spurt. It should be noted that the growth curve for Daspletosaurus on this chart is likely inaccurate, as it was based on the data from the misidentified juvenile Gorgosaurus. When it was thought dinosaurs had ectothermic metabolisms, Tyrannosaurids were assumed to have lived long lives, since it would have taken them a long time to reach their full size. The ancient philosopher Thales of Miletus once remarked that the strangest thing he had ever seen was an aged tyrant. While he wasn't referring to Tyrannosaurids, of which he had no knowledge, this remark proved more accurate for them than the estimated lifespans created by the paleontologists a century prior did. The oldest T-Rex specimen, nicknamed Trix, was roughly 30 years old when it died. The oldest individuals after it were only in their late 20s, and the oldest Gorgosaurus was only 22 years old. Even these individuals were rare and show signs of old age. This was not normal for large theropods. An individual of the giant Carcharodontosaurid Meraxes was about 40 to 50 years old when it died, and it had only reached its full size a mere 4 years before it perished, suggesting some Meraxes lived significantly longer. Furthermore, most Tyrannosaurids never even got to feel the effects of old age, as a mere 2% of all Tyrannosaurids are thought to have reached their full body size. Modern animals with similar survivorship patterns generally experience an elevated mortality rate upon reaching sexual maturity, due to both the energy cost of raising offspring and potential fights with rivals. The start of the high mortality rate in the Tyrannosaurids coincides with them reaching the subadult stage, when they appear to have reached sexual maturity. While avian dinosaurs are only sexually mature when fully grown, crocodilians reach sexual maturity once they are about half their adult size, which matches the beginning of the Tyrannosaurid subadult stage. Likewise, the youngest T-Rex with medullary bone was a 15-year-old subadult. While just 2% of the tyrant dinosaurs lived to become the largest meat-eaters in their environment, it is estimated that 25% of Tyrannosaurid hatchlings reached sexual maturity. Given how numerous Tyrannosaurid skulls possess bite marks inflicted by other Tyrannosaurids, it is clear that intraspecies conflict was common within Tyrannosauridae. Much like many modern predators, these fights were likely over mates, territory, food, or to establish dominance within the pack. Most of these fights were not fatal, as evidenced by signs of healing, and are rare on the rest of the skeleton, although they would have taken their toll on the population. A particularly devastating injury has been found on a Tyrannosaurus rex specimen nicknamed Y-Rex, which had a large segment of its tail bitten off by another Tyrannosaurus. It survived the initial attack, although it may have died afterwards from the resulting infection. The start of the subadult stage was also when Tyrannosaurids began to hunt large dinosaurs. Despite the many advantages of the Tyrannosaurids, regular combat with such behemoths would have put them at serious risk. In the words of Tyrannosaur expert Dr. Thomas R. Holtz Jr., Tyrannosaurs lived fast and died young. However, while Tyrannosaurids grew faster than many other large theropods, and on par with elephants, their growth was slow compared to many other dinosaurs. Contemporary hadrosaurs, even the nearly T-Rex-sized Albertosaurus, were able to reach their full body size in less than half the time it took their bone-crushing tormentors. This was because growth during the juvenile stage was delayed. Combined with their short lifespans, all but a few exceptionally elderly individuals would have spent at least half their lives as juveniles. Extended childhoods are present in some other animals, including humans and elephants, to give their minds time to develop and learn important social cues. Another example that is likely more pertinent to Tyrannosauridae is the prehistoric crocodilian relative Sarcosuchus, nicknamed the supercroc, which, despite being slightly smaller than Dinosuchus, took nearly twice as long to grow. Both of the semi-aquatic predators exhibited ontogenetic knee shift, but Sarcosuchus was a particularly extreme example. Juveniles had slender snouts matching the shape of specialized fish-eating crocodilians, but as it approached its massive adult size, the snout widened into a shape capable of killing dinosaurs. Because it was able to fill its juvenile niche so well, it was advantageous to extend this developmental stage. The same was true of the Tyrannosaurids. While tyrant hatchlings and adults both had high mortality rates, it is estimated that 70% of juvenile Tyrannosaurids lived to see adulthood. They hunted fairly undaunting prey, and were larger than any other carnivores in their ecosystem, save for older, slower Tyrannosaurids, which explains their rarity in the fossil record. Delaying adulthood, and potentially gaining valuable hunting experience before then, ultimately increase the chances of successfully reproducing. At the species level, this lifestyle also proved advantageous. It would have taken a lot of territory to support a single adult Albertosaurus, let alone a T-Rex. However, Tyrannosaurid populations were able to support much greater genetic diversity than this would imply, due to their high adult turnover rate, but numerous juveniles. As these juveniles hunted different prey, they had little impact on the potential size of the adult population. Given the high adult mortality rate, low juvenile mortality rate, and their long childhoods, the juveniles are estimated to have exceeded the biomass of the adults in at least 5 species of Tyrannosaurid, and likely most Tyrannosaurids except perhaps the smaller Asian species. Of course, not all Tyrannosaurids were the same, as some Tyrannosaurid juveniles may have instead hunted alongside the adults as a pack. Paleontologist Dr. Philip J. Curry has been one of the major advocates of this hypothesis. The idea that Tyrannosaurids lived in groups has been controversial, but not without evidence. Purported packs have been reported for all Tyrannosaurids known from numerous specimens, except for Gorgosaurus. These are Albertosaurus, Teratophoneus, Daspletosaurus, T-Rex, and Tarbosaurus. The T-Rex pack includes the famous Sioux specimen and 3 other individuals, while Tarbosaurus have been found together at multiple sites, but their full geologic and taphonomic contexts haven't yet been published in peer-reviewed journals. The Albertosaurus and Teratophoneus bone beds have been studied much more thoroughly. The Teratophoneus bone bed contains 4 to 5 tyrants, while the Albertosaurus bone bed contains at least 26 individuals. That may sound like a lot, but it is actually less than some lion prides. The presumed Tyrannosaurid packs consist of mixed age groups, ranging from 2-year-olds to elderly adults. A common claim when the skeletons of multiple carnivorous theropods are found together is that they were victims of predator traps, but the geology of both sites are inconsistent with this. They are thought to have instead been killed by flooding, conditions that are unlikely to have brought together the remains of so many unassociated Tyrannosaurids together, as they were rare components of their ecosystems. While the forces that created the Daspletosaurus bone bed haven't been well studied, it probably wasn't a predator trap either, as all of the Tyrannosaurid skeletons found at the site belonged to it, rather than the more common Gorgosaurus. As an alternative explanation, it has been suggested they were attracted to the area by the numerous Hadrosaur skeletons also found there, and were then killed by other Daspletosaurus in a feeding frenzy. Tyrannosaurid feeding traces have been found on some Tyrannosaurus and Daspletosaurus fossils, suggesting they did engage in cannibalism, and similar feeding frenzies can be observed in modern Komodo dragons. However, no Tyrannosaurid feeding traces have been found on individuals from the Daspletosaurus bone bed, unlike the local Hadrosaurs, so they may have formed a genuine pack. While the evidence of Tyrannosaurid cannibalism at other sites may seem to contradict the pack hunting hypothesis, lions also occasionally engage in cannibalism, despite living together in prides. There's also a fossilized trackway in Canada that preserves the footprints of what appears to have been 3 Tyrannosaurids that were traveling together. Besides the fossils of Tyrannosaurids that died together, their exceptional sense of smell also supports the idea they lived in groups, as gregarious birds tend to have a stronger sense of smell than solitary species, which allows them to easily recognize each other. The ornamentation on Tyrannosaurid skulls may have supplemented this function. Major arguments against the idea of Tyrannosaurids hunting in packs are the claims that this behavior is absent in their closest living relatives, birds and crocodilians, and that they were not intelligent enough to coordinate together. However, this is simply not true. Some birds, such as the carrion crow and Harris hawks, do work together to capture prey. Likewise, crocodilians, whom Tyrannosaurids are thought to have exceeded in intelligence, have been observed coordinating with each other when hunting. Besides Tyrannosaurids, other theropods have been found together in bone beds. These include the early Jurassic apex predator Dilophosaurus, the giant Carcharodontosaurid carnosaur Mapusaurus, the recently discovered Central Asian Metriocanthosaurid carnosaur Apkarakush, and even the large basal Tyrannosaurid Eutyrannus. It therefore seems hunting in packs was common, if not necessarily the norm, among Mesozoic theropods. Much like modern predators, the social dynamics within Tyrannosauridae likely varied considerably between species. Some species may have been truly solitary hunters, while others may have worked together in coordinated packs. Much like coyotes, some Tyrannosaurids may have lived together but hunted alone, or the parents may have protected their offspring for years but expected them to find their own food. If left to their own devices, some juvenile Tyrannosaurids may have formed their own packs, but then shifted to a solitary lifestyle as they grew. Finally, even lone hunters may have congregated on occasion to form mobs. The Tyrannosaurids possessed numerous adaptations that made them some of the most dangerous predators the world has ever seen, but there was certainly strong evolutionary pressure for them to work together. As mentioned before, some of their favorite prey may have been faster than them, a disadvantage that could be overcome through teamwork. Additionally, many of the contemporary large herbivores lived in massive herds, with the bone beds of some species, like the Ceratopsian Centrosaurus, containing thousands of individuals. Even the Tyrannosaurids would have struggled hunting alone in such conditions, while working in a pack would have allowed them to safely isolate their victims from the herd, much as in lions. The existence of such vast herds would have also meant the Tyrannosaurids' food supply was concentrated, allowing them to live within close proximity of each other despite their massive size and dietary requirements. This illustrates how predators are in many ways products of their prey. The dominant herbivores before the rise of the Tyrannosaurs had been the giant, long-necked sauropods. The adult size of most sauropods was able to casually exceed that of anything most Tyrannosaurids lived alongside. The largest individuals were almost certainly immune to predation, but sauropod populations were even more biased towards juveniles than most other dinosaurs. They provided ample prey for local carnosaurs and ceratosaurs, since unlike the later herbivores, sauropods didn't usually take care of their offspring. Furthermore, sauropods were fairly slow, so by using their blade-like teeth to wear them down from blood loss, carnosaurs didn't need to confront large sauropods in risky, head-on confrontations. The herbivores of Late Cretaceous North America and Asia were primarily the so-called duck-billed hadrosaurs, the ceratopsians, and the heavily armored ankylosaurs. These dinosaurs were ornithischians, which formed the third major branch of dinosaurs besides sauropods and theropods. Although they were never completely safe from the jaws of the Tyrannosaurids, pound for pound, these late Cretaceous Laurasian herbivores tended to be better equipped to defend themselves than the preceding sauropods. Furthermore, many of these ornithischians took care of their young, so even though the Tyrannosaurids are thought to have preferred to target juveniles, they would have still often been forced to confront the parents. Most of these large ornithischians were faster than sauropods, so hunts had to be ended swiftly else they escape. This spurred the development of the Tyrannosaurid's bone-crushing bite, which was suited for quick, decisive engagements. The drawback of this strategy is that it was ill-suited for handling prey substantially larger than themselves. This is why, despite the smaller adult size of their prey, Tyrannosaurids evolved to become as large or larger than the Carnosaurs, as this was also the size of most of the other contemporary large dinosaurs. While the, often literal, strengths of the Tyrannosaurids could be used to mischaracterize the Carnosaurs as worse at the apex predator niche, they were simply adapted to hunt different animals. Indeed, they were specialized for killing far larger animals than the Tyrannosaurids were accustomed to dealing with. However, battles between sauropods and Tyrannosaurids did happen. While the North American sauropods died out in the same extinction event that allowed for the rise of the Tyrannosaurids, in Asia, their diversity was either merely diminished, or they swiftly recolonized the continent. They did not include Brontosaurus, Apatosaurus, Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, or other household names, which were long since extinct. Instead, all late Cretaceous Asian sauropods, and indeed, those remaining in the rest of the world, belonged to the subclade Titanosauria. While Titanosaurs were the dominant herbivores in the southern hemisphere, Asian sauropods, such as Nemegtosaurus, were now just one of several lineages of large herbivores, and no longer the most prominent. Because of this, the local Tyrannosaurids didn't evolve to become sauropod hunting specialists like the Carnosaurs had. That is not to say they had no effect on their evolution. It has been suggested the jaw-locking mechanism in Tarbosaurus evolved to grant its skull the greater stability needed when holding onto these larger dinosaurs. This clearly paid off, as isotopic analysis of Tarbosaurus teeth, which retained their original isotopic composition, has found that its diet primarily consisted of sauropods and hadrosaurs. As mentioned before, the contemporary Allosaurus and the North American Tyrannosaur Bestahioversor had similar jaw-locking mechanisms. While Allosaurus was too small to hunt giants, it could have still occasionally hunted juvenile sauropods, even if there were not nearly as many of them in its environment as during the Jurassic and early Cretaceous periods. The jaw-locking mechanism in Bestahioversor is more perplexing, as it isn't thought to have lived alongside sauropods. However, sauropods did eventually return to North America after Bestahioversor's time, but they came not from Asia, but South America. This happened by at least 69 million years ago, although it potentially transpired as early as 73 million years ago, during the late Campanian. The late Cretaceous North American sauropods appear to have consisted of only a single species, Alamosaurus, and it only inhabited the southern portion of Laramidia. While the late Cretaceous Asian titanosaurs tended to have a relatively small body size, Alamosaurus is among the largest known sauropods. Without the specializations of Tarbosaurus, Tyrannosaurus would have had difficulty hunting this behemoth in spite of its own exceptional size. Despite T-Rex's great evolutionary success allowing it to spread throughout Laramidia, this expansive range came with drawbacks, namely, not being able to specialize for the local environments and their inhabitants. With the exception of the medium-sized Allosaurus, how the niches varied between the different Tyrannosaurid subgroups is unclear, but the differences between the skulls of juvenile and adult Albertosaurines are fewer than in most other Tyrannosaurids, particularly Tyrannosaurus. This suggests there were less differences between the diets of the different life stages, with small dinosaurs perhaps retaining a place in the diets of mature Albertosaurines. Isotopic analysis of Tyrannosaurid teeth suggest the more powerful Tyrannosaurines may have favored hunting ceratopsians, while the more gracile Albertosaurines preferred to hunt the presumably less dangerous hadrosaurs. Despite being portrayed as nearly defenseless in media, hadrosaurs were only weaker in comparison, with their size and powerful tails serving as effective deterrents. Still, against a fully grown Tyrannosaurid, the best hope for most species was to run away, and only confront them if there was no other choice. A large part of the evolutionary success of the hadrosaurs was their fast growth rate. This allowed them to both reach their full size quicker and have a better chance to reproduce before succumbing to the jaws of the tyrannosaurs. Of course, not all hadrosaurs were the same. The Asian hadrosaur Qianzhousaurus reached a weight of at least 13 tons, making it the largest known non-sauropod dinosaur. As such, it has largely managed to avoid the helpless stereotype of the rest of Hadrosauroidea, with paleoart often depicting Qianzhousaurus successfully warding off Qianzhousaurus, itself one of the larger Tyrannosaurids. While exceptional, the giant Qianzhousaurus does not appear to have been a complete aberration, as hadrosaur footprints from late Campanian North America appear to have been made by a hadrosaur of similar size. The dinosaurs most associated with the Tyrannosaurids are ceratopsians, namely the branch of large horned species named Ceratopsidae. Despite their fame, ceratopsids were largely a North American phenomenon. Only a single species, Sinoceratops, is known from Asia. Still, in North America, ceratopsids were a regular part of the fauna. Ceratopsian horns and frills are thought to have been primarily used for display and combat against rivals within their own species, which explains their vast diversity. Even so, they would have also been very useful against tyrannosaurids. While the horns of some species, like Qianzhousaurus, were not well suited for stabbing, they appear to have been the evolutionary predecessors of the nasal bosses of Pachyrhinosaurus, which were used for ramming. Likewise, although they made poor armor, their frills would have made it difficult for tyrannosaurids to attack their more vulnerable necks, and would have also made them look more intimidating. Besides their showier features, ceratopsian beaks were also powerful weapons. Combined with their size, ceratopsids would have been challenging prey. A puncture wound thought to have been inflicted by a Triceratops has been found on a Tyrannosaurus rex specimen. Even more striking, the skeleton of what was either a young Tyrannosaurus or Nanotyrannus has been found that appears to have died fighting a large ceratopsian, usually identified as Triceratops, which together are called the dueling dinosaurs. This could have been the result of an attack by a Tyrannosaurus pack that went awry, or the ceratopsian may have been the aggressor, attacking the young Tyrannosaurid in an attempt to remove a potential future threat to itself and its herd, or out of sheer aggression. The ability to stand and fight, even against the Tyrannosaurids, was vital for the ceratopsids, as they were poor runners when compared to hadrosaurs, and are thought to have preferred more open environments. Additionally, whereas Tyrannosaurids were exceptional swimmers, ceratopsids were not, and would have struggled to keep their heads above the water. While the species changed over time, the fauna the Tyrannosaurids coexisted with in North America was largely the same for most of their evolutionary history. That changed during the late Maastrichtian. During the last few million years of the Age of Dinosaurs, the species in Laramidia were substantially bigger than what was typical during the early Maastrichtian and Campanian ages. This is most noticeable among the largest herbivores, which were growing as huge as elephants, but even smaller species had become larger than their predecessors. The cause of this increase in body size is unclear, but it may have been the result of a less seasonal climate following the partial filling in of the western interior seaway, which would have allowed for more consistent growth rates throughout the year. It was this environment that helped to produce the Tyrant King. However, it is important to stress that the divide between the two faunas was not as stark as once thought. The hadrosaur Edmontosaurus was already a giant even before the late Maastrichtian, although it coexisted with a number of normal-sized cousins. Likewise, all of the large Laramedian herbivores from this time were previously thought to be giants, but a few normal-sized species, such as Cretaceous, have also recently been identified in late Maastrichtian Laramidia. Recent evidence has also found a number of older megaherbivores in the formations in the American Southwest. Although not as common as during the late Maastrichtian, they provided the resource basis necessary to support the T-Rex-sized Tyrannosaurus micraensis. The divide between herbivore size was even less stark in Asia, as it was already home to some huge megaherbivores by at least the late Campanian, which in turn allowed for the evolution of tyrannosaurians like Qianzhousaurus and Tarbosaurus. Another trait that distinguishes late Maastrichtian North America from the preceding 15 million years is that the hadrosaurs and ceratopsians were less diverse than before. Hadrosaurs had been split into two groups: the Lambeosaurines, which possessed hollow bony crest, as in Parasaurolophus, and the Saurolophines, which had either solid bony crest, as in the namesake Saurolophus, or no bony crest at all, as in Gryposaurus. As a side note, soft tissue crests have been found in the Saurolophine Edmontosaurus, and may have thus been present in the rest of the Saurolophines. The ceratopsids were also divided into two major subclades: the Chasmosaurines, which had long brow horns and elongated frills, and the Centrosaurines, which usually had longer nasal horns, shortened frills, and were generally smaller. As another side note, the brow horns were longer than the nasal horns in basal centrosaurines such as Nasutoceratops and the recently discovered Lokiceratops. During the late Maastrichtian, Centrosaurine ceratopsians appear to have gone extinct, while Lambeosaurine hadrosaurs were either rare or absent in North America, although they remained common in Asia. What species of Saurolophines and Chasmosaurines remained were also not very diverse, with older work suggesting just 3 species between them across 3 ecosystems. However, more recent fieldwork in the southwestern United States has found additional species, such as Bravoceratops and the previously mentioned Critosaurus. Still, this was much less diversity than before, which was likely why a single species of Tyrannosaurid, Tyrannosaurus rex, was the top predator across the entire western half of North America. The final group of large ornithischians that lived alongside and were hunted by the Tyrannosaurids were the Ankylosaurs. While they had no chance of outrunning them, they were protected by bony osteoderms, and those on their tails had evolved to serve as effective weapons. In one subgroup of Ankylosaurs, the Ankylosaurids, the osteoderms formed into a club, while those of other species were instead built for piercing. Fortunately for the Tyrannosaurids, Ankylosaurs were never the most abundant herbivores in their ecosystems. The Ankylosaurs belonged to the broader ornithischian subclade Thyreophora, which also included the Stegosaurs. Despite Tyrannosaurus sometimes being shown alongside Stegosaurus in media, they were not contemporaries. Stegosaurus lived during the late Jurassic, with more time separating the two than separates T-Rex from humans. Furthermore, Stegosaurs in general became extinct during the start of the Late Cretaceous, perhaps in the same extinction event that allowed the Tyrannosaurid's ancestors to become large carnivores, so the two clades never encountered each other. Likewise, even though the iconic pterosaur Pteranodon is often shown in the background of depictions of Tyrannosaurus rex, it lived between 90 to 80 million years ago, long before the Tyrant King. Pteranodon did coexist with some other Tyrannosaurids, but since it hunted marine prey, they would have only encountered each other along the coast. For the most part, Tyrannosaurids would have usually interacted with the large marine reptiles only when scavenging their washed-up corpses, but since they were good swimmers, encounters with live specimens probably did happen on rare occasions. While the juveniles of the large herbivorous dinosaurs filled many of the niches which are instead filled by small adult animals in mammal-dominated ecosystems, there were still some small adult dinosaurs. Although they were generally too small for most adult Tyrannosaurids to bother with, even if they could catch them, they formed the bulk of the diets of the juveniles and the medium-sized Alioramens and Asiatyrannus. Among these were the Leptoceratopsids, small species of hornless ceratopsians distantly related to the ceratopsids, some of whom retained the ability to walk on 2 legs. An outlier among Leptoceratopsidae was the Asian Udanoceratops, which overlapped in size with smaller ceratopsids, and with its powerful jaws, was no less dangerous. A similar group of ceratopsians were the Protoceratopsids, which were among the dinosaurs mentioned earlier that laid soft-shelled eggs. They have only been found in what were Asian deserts, so encounters with even juvenile tyrants would have been rare. The same was true of the Asian Pachycephalosaurs. The North American branch of these dome-headed dinosaurs instead seemed to have inhabited mountainous environments, where they were once again also unlikely to encounter Tyrannosaurids. When they did, their best chance for survival was to either run or hide. Although used in battles against each other, their dome heads were not suited for high-speed ramming, and would have been of little use against large carnivores. Other small dinosaurs, the Thescelosaurids, looked similar to the small ornithischians that had lived in terror of the first carnosaurs. Thescelosaurids such as Orodromeus were fast runners, and careful excavation of their remains has also found that they lived in burrows, where they would have been able to seek refuge from young tyrant dinosaurs. During the Late Cretaceous, many of the small herbivore and omnivore niches were filled by Coelurosaurian theropods, all of which belonged to the more bird-like subclade Maniraptoriformes. Among the most common prey for young Tyrannosaurids were the toothless Oviraptorosaurs. It was juveniles of one of these dinosaurs, Cytipes, that were found in the stomach of a young Gorgosaurus. The Gorgosaurus in question was between 5 to 7 years old when it died, while the Cytipes were about 1 year old. However, adult Cytipes are also within the expected size range for prey of Tyrannosaurids of this size. All Oviraptorosaurs found in North America belong to the subclade Caenagnathidae. An Asian caenagnatid, Gigantoraptor, is notable for growing nearly as large as many Tyrannosaurids, although it is unclear whether it actually lived during the same time as them. If it did, unlike other Oviraptorosaurs, Gigantoraptor would have been the prey of large adult Tyrannosaurids. Asia was also home to an endemic branch of Oviraptorosauria called Oviraptoridae, whose members had shorter, deeper skulls and heavier builds. While Oviraptorosaurs seem to have been a staple for younger Tyrannosaurids, the main prey of older juveniles were likely the medium-sized ornithomimids, the so-called ostrich dinosaurs. Ornithomimids were among the fastest of all dinosaurs, which may have been why juvenile Tyrannosaurids evolved to become such accomplished runners themselves. One ornithomimid, Dinochirus, evolved in a very different direction, reaching a size comparable to the largest Tyrannosaurids. Combined with long arms equipped with powerful claws, Dinochirus would have been a challenge for even adults of the contemporary Tyrannosaurid Tarbosaurus. They were still far from immune from predation, as Tarbosaurus bite marks have been found on the Dinochirus holotype. While only known from fragmentary fossils, relatives of Dinochirus, such as Parazinosaurus, have been found in North America. They were smaller than Dinochirus, but larger than other ornithomimids, suggesting a similar defensive strategy of prioritizing power over speed. A separate group of giant Maniraptoriform theropods, the Therizinosaurs, were even slower, and their arms were equipped with even larger claws. Therizinosaurs are found primarily in Asia, but fragmentary Therizinosaur fossils, along with their distinctive four-toed footprints, have been found in Late Cretaceous North America. The largest of these bizarre, plant-eating theropods, the namesake Therizinosaurus, had the largest claws of any animal. These are thought to have been useful weapons against the Tyrannosaurids, even the mighty Tarbosaurus, but recent research suggests its claws were highly fragile. Therizinosaurus instead seems to have used them for display, which could have also scared off predators. On the other hand, the less outlandish claws of other Therizinosaurs were still well suited to serve as weapons. Discounting some close relatives that may have themselves been Tyrannosaurids, the largest carnivorous dinosaurs that coexisted with the Tyrannosaurids were the Dromaeosaurids and the Troodontids. At least some Troodontids seem to have been omnivores, while the Dromaeosaurids were pure carnivores, and likely favored larger prey. Both groups of these bird-like dinosaurs would have been some of the greatest threats for hatchling Tyrannosaurids, but as they grew, they shifted to become competitors. Despite their reputation, Dromaeosaurids were actually slower, but more powerful than Tyrannosaurids during their first few years. Of course, Tyrannosaurids eventually came to greatly surpass them in size, turning their former tormentors into prey. A notable exception from the norm was the Asian Achillobator, a heavily built, 5-meter-long dromaeosaurid comparable in size to the local tyrannosaur Electrosaurus. However, because the age of the formation the two are found in is uncertain, it is possible Achillobator lived before the first proper Tyrannosaurids. If so, then a Kilobator may be an example of a giant dromaeosaurid that had begun to replace the recently extinct Carnosaurs before being outcompeted by the even larger, yet faster, Tyrannosaurids. On the other hand, footprints belonging to a similarly sized troodontid have been found in China, dating to just before the Cenomanian-Turonian extinction. For the past decade, it has been claimed that a similar dromaeosaurid named Dakotaraptor lived in North America during the late Maastrichtian. However, its fossils are chimeric, meaning they don't belong to a single species. Indeed, most of the bones don't belong to dromaeosaurids, and some don't even belong to dinosaurs. Although it does appear that a large dromaeosaurid of some sort did inhabit late Maastrichtian North America, it had the great misfortune to live alongside Tyrannosaurus rex, who would have greatly overshadowed it. Despite its increased size, it was still the fox to the T-Rex's lion. The carnivores that would have provided the most trouble for the Tyrannosaurids were not dinosaurs at all. Among these was a group of pterosaurs called Azhdarchids. They were the largest creatures to have ever flown, and the European Azhdarchid Hastegopteryx was even the top predator on some islands in Europe. That said, the Azhdarchids in Asia and North America, such as Quetzalcoatlus and Cryodracon, had a lighter build, and were restricted to relatively small prey. They were about as tall as Tyrannosaurids, and had a good chance of warding one off. Although they were threats to young Tyrannosaurs, in a fight to the death, adult Tyrannosaurids had an overwhelming advantage. A major reason they could afford to be so brave as to confront a Tyrannosaurid is that these pterosaurs were able to swiftly fly away. It is notable that, much as in the Tyrannosaurids, Azhdarchids experienced extreme ontogenetic niche shift, with juveniles of one species occupying the ecological roles that had once been filled by several different, small adult pterosaurs. Perhaps the only local carnivore that could truly rival adult Tyrannosaurids was the gigantic crocodilian Deinosuchus, who could grow nearly as large as Tyrannosaurus rex. Furthermore, the bite force of this giant crocodilian is estimated to have been twice as great as that of even the Tyrant King. Fortunately for the Tyrannosaurids, Deinosuchus lived along the coast, reducing the potential for competition and conflict between them. However, Deinosuchus fossils have been found in the same bone bed as the presumed Teratophoneus pack, so interactions between these two dynasties of megapredators did happen. Attempts by adult Tyrannosaurids to lure faster dinosaurs into the water might have occasionally ended with them becoming prey in these regions. On the other hand, as an ectotherm, Deinosuchus would not have been as active as the endothermic Tyrannosaurids, so when on land, even smaller Tyrannosaurids would have had the advantage when facing this massive megacroc. Deinosuchus is thought to have died out when part of the western interior seaway closed during the late Maastrichtian, destroying its habitat. Climate change and the introduction of new predators have been what caused the fall of most of prehistory's great predatory dynasties. Such subtle forces may have been responsible for the extinction of generalist tyrannosaurids such as Albertosaurus. They appear to have been replaced by more specialized tyrannosaurids, such as the long-snouted, nimble Qianzhousaurus, and the giant, powerful Tyrannosaurids. Tyrannosaurids could better endure disruptions in the food chain than other top predators, as the subadults could still reproduce if conditions became disfavorable for the adults. However, 66 million years ago, Tyrannosauridae faced the most destructive event in the history of the Earth when a meteor hit the Yucatan Peninsula. The initial devastation was intense, but the impact also created a massive cloud of debris in the atmosphere, blocking sunlight. The resulting famine was more than any large predator could hope to endure. Even Tyrannosaurid hatchlings were too large to be supported by the meager food that remained. In the end, Tyrannosauridae was doomed, along with the other non-avian dinosaurs, and 75% of all life on Earth. In decades past, the extinction of the Tyrannosaurs, and Dinosauria as a whole, was portrayed as the clumsy, awkward reptiles being outcompeted by the superior mammals, or them simply going out on their own accord. It is impossible to know whether or not the Tyrannosaurids would still be here if the meteor had never struck the Earth, and the KPG mass extinction event never happened, but they were neither awkward nor clumsy. Their extinction was not due to a supposed inferiority to mammals, but because of an apocalyptic disaster that no large animal could hope to survive. That it took such a cataclysm to cut their reign short is a testament to Tyrannosauridae's success. The reign of the tyrant dinosaurs may have been short and geographically limited, but they were without a doubt some of nature's most remarkable predators. Despite the size of the Tyrannosaurids, besides Tyrannosaurus, typically being unexceptional by the standards of the Mesozoic era, they wielded far greater power than their predecessors like Allosaurus or Tarbosaurus, with their robust and sturdy skulls and thickened teeth allowing them to crush bone with ease. Combined with their wider, more powerful builds, the strength of the Tyrannosaurids eclipsed that of all other theropod dinosaurs. Yet as made clear throughout this video, the Tyrannosaurids did not rely on just brute strength. Despite their immense weight, they remained capable of surprising acts of agility and grace, and juvenile Tyrannosaurids were some of the fastest runners to ever evolve. Even in species so large that they were incapable of running, their long legs continued to prove useful, as they allowed them to conserve energy when roaming. The Tyrannosaurids also benefited from exceptional senses of smell, hearing, and vision, and were more intelligent than other large carnivorous dinosaurs. Their extreme form of ontogenetic knee shift also allowed them to dominate the ecosystems of Late Cretaceous North America and Asia in a way no predator had before humans, as just a few, and in many cases one species of tyrant, was able to fill all of the medium to large-sized predator niches during its lifespan. Not only did the tyrant dinosaurs have the greatest raw power of the Mesozoic terrestrial carnivores, but they also had a number of more subtle advantages over their predecessors. While often the most pronounced in Tyrannosaurus, most of these adaptations were present in the rest of the Tyrannosaurids to the exclusion of other large theropods. Yet for all their similarities to T-Rex, and the clade's relatively restricted geographical and temporal range, there was still a substantial degree of diversity contained within Tyrannosauridae. The long-snouted, medium-sized Allosaurus were the most divergent, having sacrificed the power of their ancestors in exchange for retaining their exceptional speed into adulthood, and bringing it to new heights. Asia-Tyrannus was even smaller, but retained bone-crushing jaws. The species most like Tyrannosaurus were the other members of its subclade Tyrannosauridnae, like Tarbosaurus and Qianzhousaurus. They were only moderately smaller and less bulky than the namesake Tyrannosaurus, but even Tarbosaurus was highly distinct from its more famous cousin, with even smaller arms and jaws better suited for hunting sauropod dinosaurs. The most typical Tyrannosaurid was not Tyrannosaurus rex, or any other giant Tyrannosaurin, but instead their probable ancestor Daspletosaurus. A similar group were Teratophoneans like Lythronax, who inhabited the American Southwest. The earliest branch of Tyrannosaurus to branch off, Albertosaurinae, were more gracile than most of their cousins, but remained larger and far more powerful than the Allosaurus. While once thought to represent the pinnacle of the evolution of other large theropods like the carnosaurs, the Tyrannosaurids were instead the gigantic descendants of small carnivores more closely related to birds. Gaps in the fossil record hamper a precise understanding of how this happened, but a basic timeline of when Tyrannosauridae's major traits first emerged has been established, as outlined in this video. Recent discoveries also suggest that the shift to large body size in the Tyrannosaurids was enabled by ecological vacancies created by a major extinction event that transpired roughly 94 million years ago. Despite the extensive scientific research focused on the tyrant dinosaurs, mysteries remain regarding their biology, although as explored throughout the video, these gaps are slowly being filled. Whether the Tyrannosaurids had feathers like other Allosaurs is currently a mixture of hard facts and speculation. Most Tyrannosaurids were certainly covered at least partially by scales, and almost entirely so in the case of adult Tyrannosaurians. However, they may have retained small patches of feathers, and larger coats remain plausible in the Allosaurus, the polar Nanuqsaurus, and in the juveniles of larger species. On the other hand, the evidence for some Tyrannosaurids living together in social groups is strong, and they may very well have taken care of their offspring and hunted in packs. Yet numerous paleopathologies also indicate that Tyrannosaurids regularly fought each other, which likely contributed to their shortened lifespans compared to other large carnivores. Questions also persist regarding the Tyrannosaurid's small, two-fingered arms. While no longer effective weapons, Tyrannosaurid Arms were not vestigial either, although their purpose remains unknown. What is clear is that their arms shrank to allow for the enlargement of their devastating skulls. As this video has hopefully demonstrated, despite the common confusion between them, the Tyrannosaurids were highly distinct from other large theropod dinosaurs like Allosaurus in form, behavior, and ecology. Tyrannosauridae revolutionized the basic theropod body plan, taking it to extremes never seen before, and that have never been seen again. The Tyrannosaurids combined both brain and brawn into a deadly package. They were extraordinary. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and a thank you to my supporters on Patreon. Also a thank you to my Patreon supporters and the rest of my subscribers for your patience, as it took a long time to make this video. I hope you liked it. This is the bibliography of the various scientific papers that were cited in this video, as there are far too many to fit in the video description. Since Tyrannosauridae has received a lot of attention by paleontologists, it thus took a lot of research to write this video. It is easily the longest one I have ever done. The predecessor of the script was originally about the even broader clade Tyrannosauridae. I abandoned it since, unlike the Tyrannosaurids, there are not a lot of generalities regarding the members of the clade, as the earliest Tyrannosaurids have little to distinguish them from other basalsaurolosaurs. Since the topics I make videos about are usually more obscure, I was hesitant to make another video relating to Tyrannosaurus. However, I was surprised that no one had made a detailed video like this about the Tyrannosaurs before, as there was a lot that makes them unique, and eventually decided to do something about it. Given how long it ended up being, most of the information about basal Tyrannosauroids found its way into the video anyway. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to hit the like button, and consider subscribing if you'd like to see more. If you'd like to support this channel more directly, you can join my Patreon, where you'll have access to polls to select the topics of future videos. Finally, be sure to have a great day.